Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Jules, and today is Friday, the 12th of August 2011. Returning to the show is Clif from halfpasthuman.com. Hi Clif, thanks for coming back to the show during this extremely eventful week.
Thank you for having me. It's been a very interesting times indeed, yes.
For sure. The WebBot Forum administrator is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us tonight. They include members Chipperdog, Green Meadow, Diane VG, Lenny, Paul Muir, and Turd Ferguson. For listeners, this interview will assume you have a good understanding of Clif's work, familiarity with his shape reports, and have listened to his past interviews, in particular to his last interviews with Veritas, TMRN, and Suzanne Toro. Again, Clif's website is halfpasthuman.com. The interview again will be available on YouTube for free on the WebBot Forum channel and at the website webbotforum.com. Today's interview will start with a discussion on current events. Following that, we'll discuss member questions, and at the end, we'll discuss the future and boats. Yes, boats. And why boats may be such a valuable tool in the future, along with 3 pairs of good shoes and a good cave. Cliff, let's start economics. In the message you passed onto the forum last Friday, you stated that questions posed to you may be moot by the time we reach the 12th. With the S&P downgrading U.S. sovereign debt, the 500-point moves in the Dow, the spike in gold to just short of $1,800 US an ounce, and the continual collapse of Europe spreading to Italy, Spain, and now French banks. Is this what you were expecting, and do you still expect $5 and $20 a day moves in silver?
Yes to both. The first, though, I actually expected we'd be further along. We have a 3-day variance in our time projection on the immediacy data, so I actually had thought that the events we'll see by the 15th and 16th would have manifested by now, and so we would be further into the process and have a little bit more to chew on here. But yes to both. I still expect the $5 and then a $20 days and then a series of collapses. And we're seeing a couple of the temporal markers along the way that we'd talked about, including the blue bankruptcy. It is the post office.
Wow. Before we hand over to Joe, I just want a quick one. What do you expect on the 15th and the 16th?
No, not anything in particular. I have a few things that we think will pop over these next few days, especially related to the Obama administration. But that gets a little tricky. You don't want to be really accurate in forecasting that sort of stuff, or you might get a visit from some Treasury agents, which I'd rather avoid, to be honest. So I won't say anything specific about that, but over these next few days there will be some visible progression in both the political chaos and the economic chaos, such that on the 15th and 16th we'll say, aha, we've added another 20% to the total chaos pyramid that we're building here, if we sort of think of it as building the pyramid from the bottom up.
Wow, interesting. Turd, did you have some questions for Clif?
Oh, yes, I sure do. Clif, let me tell you, it is a terrific pleasure to get a chance to visit with you.
Oh, this is great. Yeah, I follow your stuff. I love people with interesting names, so hey.
I was telling everyone earlier, if I had given it more thought, I would have come up with something more glamorous than Turd.
No. There's a whole lot of good karma associated with that, and going back centuries and centuries and centuries. Sometime offline, I'll go into that with you.
I like the sound. That'll make my mother feel better. I know that. Well, and I, anticipating this opportunity to speak with you, I solicited some of the members of my website to see if there were some things that they wanted me to discuss with you. And I guess I would start with the potential for war and what you see there, and that it is, I don't want to call it an organizing principle of society, but it seems like when...
No, we should call it exactly that. We should acknowledge that it's been labeled appropriately by such eminent worthies as Catherine Austin Fitts when she notes the central bank warfare model, because it truly is that. They must indeed have a war in order for things to accelerate in their particular agenda.
Exactly, to perpetuate their agenda, it seems.
Correct.
And as we approach this end game or this end game, if you will, it seems that war would be one of the cards in their hand that they would play. And so along those lines, and this will dovetail into maybe a discussion about the dollar. What are you seeing? Are you anticipating anything flaring up in the Middle East?
Yes, we do actually have some linguistic support because we have kept the spiders running continuously on a couple of key phrases, especially the Israeli mistake. I'm always sweeping for that, and we actually have evidence building that they're ramping up the Israel versus Iran thing again. However, the data interpretation would argue that they have perhaps waited a bit too long. There was always this thing back maybe in the late 90s, early zeros there, where there was a discussion about Israel as a tool when we actually thought it was a tool of American foreign policy instead of the other way around. And there was a discussion that Israel would never be unleashed on the enemy, meaning Iran, until the economic collapse had been well seated. The theory being that would initiate a certain kind of economic collapse, so you could only let them go after things had reached basically where we're at now.
Right.
And so they're actually sort of ramping up that language, and it's elevated by about 6 to 7% in the last week and a half or so in the spiders that we run that check the continuing current language against forecast language. Now, this one is a little tricky because the Israeli mistake has been wafting and waning and waxing and waning like the moon, and up and down for years now, and it's never really gone away, although it had settled to a low back burner. And it's just a little bit disturbing that it's starting to come out now. However, in counterpunch, I have to say that the scathing editorials about the sellout 20% of Congress going over to be indoctrinated by the evil Zionist, that kind of language is escalating to the point where we may get some level of, balance or something out of it. It may not pan out the way the agenda people would push.
Interesting. Well, and as that, I guess, kind of dovetails into some of the other issues that folks want to discuss, and that is the ultimate fall of the dollar, not only in its value but in its end as the global reserve currency. I can see where the Saudis and all the other oil exporting countries are not only frustrated by the declining value of their dollar reserves, but since their primary product is priced in dollars, some have suggested to me that the first brushstroke of the end of the dollar will be the OPEC saying they no longer want to use the dollar as a exchange device. But does your work ever hear of that type of discussion? Do you ever see that type of thing out there?
Sure. Oh, yeah. It's been a topic of discussion for a couple of years now on some of the German economic forums. Mm-hmm. And curiously, the Polish as well. They have a keen interest in currency movements. But our data suggested that I don't know. The first signs have already happened. So if we get into some more current events over this next week and say the United States Postal Service collapses as a going entity, then we must acknowledge that at that point, I think that's a far bigger sign of dollar death than the oil or petrodollar link, primarily because the post office is the second largest mover of money in the wire transfer world. And if they're going down, maybe they'll keep that as their core business, but this is a huge impact on our social order. Right.
Well, then as that dovetails then into the dollar and then the euro, there's so much discussion about the future of the euro at this point and whether that was a failed experiment to begin with and it's now just finally coming apart. What do you see there, Clif? Do you see the euro being able to continue in its current format? I've had discussions with folks that kind of postulate that they will kick out some of the southern countries and instead have kind of a Nordic euro, and that those are discussions are already taking place, and that in the end you'll have maybe 3 regional reserve currencies rather than one global reserve currency. Do you get that feeling at all?
Sure. Yeah. You actually, I was part of the very, very, very early days of the EU experiment when it was still called the European Community, the European Trade Union, and all the other names under which they foisted it upon Europe. And there's some things that people need to understand, that if you look at it from a very broad perspective and step way back and look at the human species and at that time, you can say that here is a very curious thing indeed. Because from the period of time that they started introducing the concept of the European community, not Europe, not old Europe, but this new European community, we're talking late 50s, they really rolled it out. They'd been discussing it in the 47, 48 period, but in the late 50s they rolled it out. In the early 60s they started pushing it very hard with the young generations in Europe in the rebuilding of the aftermath of World War II. Now, curiously, even then, the younger generations were exhibiting the larger archetypical trend that we are all part of, which is what we call a self-organizing community, collectives, or a movement towards a more local community. So here we have the idea of imposing a mega supranational state on a loose collection of countries only bound by continental association and even separated by diversity of language and interests.
Yeah.
And yet they were going to make it into a national mega state starting in the 60s, and they kept pushing in spite of everybody's protest to the contrary. They kept shoving it down everybody's throats until we find ourselves with the European Trade Union, and then the European Collective Congress, and then the whole thing about Brussels, and then it just grows and grows and grows, and finally, aha, here we are, let's shove a euro currency down everybody's throat. We note that that was counter to the trend, and I personally see no intrinsic support for the euro and never have. It was not an experiment. It was a means of oppression, and I never saw it as anything other than that. Having lived through several currency crises, including the switch from the old franc to the new franc in the early 60s, and seeing the death and struggles there, I realized just how powerful currencies were at a very young age. And I knew something was fishy when everybody around me, all the adults, were just grumbling, and the old guys were always muttering under their breath and, talking into the foam of their beer about this nasty European community. And it will fail, and it's failing now. Whether we end up with a Scandinavian Union or some subset of Germanic peoples or something along those lines, it's going to be pretty much anybody's guess, but they've been talking about the Scandinavian Union for a number of years. I think that the pressures are still more for a period of, if you will, relaxation from Uber control that had been imposed by the European authority.
Yeah. Do you have, does your work suggest a timeline that you're comfortable with discussing, not only the euro but the dollar?
Sure, yeah. We can get into details, but we need to separate it into two conceptual frameworks, okay? And the one framework is absent the current level of immediacy values that are apparently obscuring all of our other data types, and thus we have to rely on old data for any projections beyond 2013. So we don't know if there's any validity to those. We have no way of validating anything from our old data set beyond the flush or the breaking wave of the immediacy data that we're in at the moment. And basically what I'm saying is that the emotions are running so high that at any moment mob rule might take over and all projections are out the window. And that's kind of how our data sets react to the level of intensity and duration values. As intensity rises, duration values decrease. So we do have we have a fairly rich data set that projected all the way out to 2041 and beyond, and there was effectively no dollar issues arising from 2014 onward. And in fact, at that point, it appeared that the calorie what we were calling the calorie economy was actually in place. And basically, at 2014 onward, our data had suggested, and we had a number of perhaps 10-year history of collecting the data, that a situation would arise where spare calories of food would be the lowest common denominator backing anything, including gold and silver. And so the next level up would be the precious metals as a storehouse of the ability to buy spare calories of food from farmers and so on. And from there on, other tradable goods, and we would gradually work our way out of what has been a horrible agenda on the part of the powers that be these last, 12,000 years.
Well, there certainly is, yeah.
Sorry, Turd. Just to elaborate with that question from Turd about the timeline, in the Shape 5 report, you actually, you gave some monkey mind timelines on what you expect might happen. Could you probably elaborate on that? Because I know in previous interviews, Clif, you said you expected first $5 and $20 days in silver, then the COMEX to collapse. You also expected Europe to collapse before the US collapsed, and then the just-in-time system to collapse. Yeah, as Turd's previous question, could you maybe paint a monkey mind step-by-step picture of what you can see? Maybe if you don't have the timeline, the actual temporal markers before all hell breaks loose?
Sure, yeah. Some of the temporal markers are easily delineated. I don't have an actual timeline because the way in which the data is presented to us, we get little clusters usually because you cannot advance the model space moment by moment, second by second in any meaningful manner. So what we sort of have to do is to blink ahead at a fairly fast rate and look for these clusters of interesting data. Those form our temporal markers. And they might appear as growing and dissolving and like crystals on some kind of speeded up high definition film. And when we get those, we know we're sort of in the right track of the shifting intensity values and so on. So what I'm looking for is a series of events that will, at the most immediate level, will be are being brokered or are being offered to us by way of the sudden blue bankruptcy. Now, I'm suspecting at this point, because of the huge number of people in blue wool suits that we're actually talking about the post office, when that starts going down, that's going to open up the floodgates for a whole series of fiscal and financial problems. Now, these are not economic in that sense. So what I'm talking about are banks and the ability to move money, and I don't want to say like a Hertzstadt lockup, but probably something not equivalent to that, but replacing that as the next generation's huge worry. And let me state something really clearly about this. The data and any rational analysis will present to you the idea that what we're currently living through is a once in history, once in a civilization level event. Because what we are contemplating is the erosion, and we're living through it now, and sometimes 2 and 3% per day, especially based on gold, maybe 10% per day, erosion of the purchasing power of a global reserve currency that will touch every human on the planet. Never in this current civilization, in the last 13,000 years, has anything close to this ever arisen. The most, the closest we can come in an approximation would be the minor event of the collapse of France and the bringing in of the Bonaparte reign and the many republics there after the John Law incidents, or the shift into the warring clan states of China following the collapse of the first Qin Empire, when their currency was seriously debased, and they'd even done a paper currency effort. It lasted some 24 years, I think. Anyway, under both of those conditions, the globe was changed. In one case, we ended up with, in China, with vast levels of diaspora as populations were shifted by the warring factions, and this in turn led to generations of nomadism and brought in the Mongolian people and all different kinds of ramifications there. So we're at that level of discussion. The discussion of whether or not stockbrokers might be plunging to their death a year from now from tall buildings is neither here nor there, because we're looking at the collapse of the former British Empire and the bust up of what people used to call Great Britain into some new entity based on the people that will endure what they're going to go through. And that same level of disruption is planet-wide. There's riots in Berlin and Madrid. They're camping out to protest the austerity and getting beaten by the police, and it just goes on and on and on. This level of planetary unquiet is the social chaos that we've been forecasting for a number of years. We're into it right now. If we look at the timeline, we'll be looking at a situation where a sudden bankruptcy opens up and exposes, if you will, the bleeding wound of the currency system, which in turn will be followed by a number of events, all of which will shake confidence and bring us to our $5 and our $20 days, and then we get a collapse. Now, before then, I expect to see the indications that the riot, an actual physical presence disruption, a scene, if you will, of uber rich will occur because they won't be able to claim their items that were theoretically stored for safekeeping, i.e. gold, I believe. And that'll be one of our next temporal markers. One of the further temporal markers we're about to get will be a shift by some of the southern economies to an entirely different structure of what I want to say, intercountry trading. And I don't know that we're even talking about a currency level kind of a thing, or if it's an amalgamation of energy companies across national borders against the wishes of the U.S., but it's going to cause some real issues relative to the aquifers that the Bushies think they own in South America. Just as we saw in India recently, the repudiation of the aristocracy's claim to divine right to rule by the judges awarding the possession of this incredible billion-dollar fortune in gold and jewels to the Indian people, which who knows if it'll be stolen by politicians or not. That isn't the point. The point is that it had been assumed it was owned by the royal family. And now we're going to see some of the assumptions that the elite have operated on tested over these next few days, the rest of this month, basically, up till about the 31st or so. And some of those tests are key temporal markers for the collision of interest that's going to be what follows the dollar dying. So it's dying at the moment. Will it last through the October crises? Probably, and it'll probably last here in the U.S. a year longer than it exists as a reserve currency. But it's still not going to be anything anybody really wants to have.
Thanks. Go ahead, Ted.
I guess my last question dealt with something that I have not really been able to get my hands around this week, and so I can't say that I know much about it. I'm trying to bring myself up to speed. But it goes right into what you're saying about the post office, and because that situation seems so unusual to me that the postal service would need to declare bankruptcy, and that there are so many different ways that they can raise revenue. But this issue that came up this week had to do with Tropos Capital Corporation. Have you heard of this, Clif?
It's a hit the spiders. The intensity value just shot through the roof for whatever reason. And
it has to do with the Bank of International Settlements, and as you talked about, the United States Postal Service being, you said, the number 2
the shifter of wire transfer. They used to be number 1 on the planet, and they were overtaken by the International Monetary Fund, which ships through the BIS. Correct.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I don't have enough about I don't know enough about this yet to be able to talk about it in a sophisticated manner.
The rumors that are going around may or may not be true, but the linkage within our data to BIS and let's say their associates. I don't want to use company names or anything like that in anything that would be released on YouTube, because then it might be come back to haunt me via somebody getting irritated that I'm offering financial advice. But let's just say that the BIS, which is a more or less closed institution, will be opened up a bit and connected by the 25th or 26th of October with the Vatican in something that nobody wants to smell anywhere. And what you're seeing now is likely, I think some of the intensity values arising from the associates of BIS are reflecting that ahead of the actual stink.
Interesting. Well, yes, and there's a lot of smoke there, and like I said, I'm trying so hard to piece it all together myself to see what it all means. But one last question, Clif, and then I'll be quiet for a while. And this is off the subject, but this comes from my daughter, if that's okay. She is a rather rambunctious, soon-to-be 8th grader, And the thing that keeps her up at night are the prospect of solar storms and the disruption that could provide. We've seen such a major uptick in solar activity in the last even weeks. Anything in your work that you see that we should be concerned about in the days to come?
Yes, there's vast quantities of it. It's not a reassuring subject. Where do you? No, I don't want to invite that. Let me put it to you this way. There's a historical precedence for people taking refuge in large caves during solar periods, and we see a concurrent movement in the federal government in the last year that's been accelerating to deny access to people in general to wilderness areas in which caves that could house many hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, are existent. The two are not a coincidence. So if one were to live in an area in which there might be a cave that, say, you could quickly drive your pickup and your family into and get out of solar radiation, then one might be advised to check that out in advance. Failing that, there are other ways to make sort of artificial caves. It's advisable to really look at the issue of the solar flaring, what NASA's doing, their alarm level in terms of the language they're using with their own people, and to make plans accordingly. And so we know, for instance, that, hang on a second. Chatamate kudasai! Misha, no. Anyway, So I cannot reassure you relative to the solar storms. We have some serious issues. Even a minor Carrington event that damages transformers on the poles out in front of our houses is going to be a serious mega event for us, because we don't make those things even on this continent anymore. And it'll be just incredible to try and trade our real treasure for those devices being made elsewhere, such that we can re-electrify our country. And if it comes to that, I have a whole lot of suggestions about how we should follow Buckminster Fuller's idea of how to electrify the planet and redistribute our electrical grid, because it makes a lot more sense than the way it's laid out now, and would be much more efficient. But beyond that, we're going to face some serious challenges with even a minor solar flaring. And as you point out, the sun is very unquiet and shows every sign of continuing that trend and even accelerating it. So at a personal level, I have the ability to crank out 15 kW off of one generator. I have a backup generator available to me for that generator should it fail. I've got solar power, because solar panels are basically immune, the panels themselves, from any solar flaring, excepting real heat or getting flared out themselves. But electrically they wouldn't burn out, so to speak. So there are a lot of things you can do, but you also need to worry about protecting yourself from radiation. I'm going to have to say that one of the experiments I actually wanted to do here today was, on another disquieting subject, was to turn on one of my radiation meters and let everybody hear, if possible, the continuing level of background radiation under which we're operating. I need to break off for about 6 minutes and assist my wife in coming back into the house, if that's okay.
No problem, Cliff.
Okay? So I'll rejoin you in about 6 minutes, okay?
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Jules, is that why you mentioned caves earlier? Or is that just a coincidence?
No, that's why I mentioned caves.
It's a very slick production you have here.
Jules is good.
And
Craig, by the way, you've got a very smart 8-year-old daughter. Where'd you get it from, the mum?
Yeah, exactly. I used to travel a lot, so we're not really sure who her dad is.
Did Cliff say that in 2014, with using the old data, that there were really no dollar problems, that we were on a calorie-based system, but there weren't like huge problems?
Yes, because there was no more currency.
Yeah. Well,
And
there's no more currency, but we were on the calorie system, and he didn't see a big financial bunch of problems.
It was after 2014, wasn't it? Nobody said.
Yeah.
So we make it to 2014.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, I'm back with you.
Okay, cool.
Oh,
Everything's okay with Kathy, I hope.
Oh, sure, everything's just fine. We had to get her in so that the dogs wouldn't throw a fit because, well, either way they're going to throw a fit, but at least they were semi-quiet, so. But she's good. She's settled in, and I'm comfortable. So, next questions.
Okay, all right. Jules, it's back to you, buddy.
So, did you have any more questions for Cliff?
No, I'm good. Thanks, Jules.
Just following on with the economic trait, and then I'll pass it on to Green Meadow. In a previous report, you had information on, actually, recently we've seen Bank of America's shares dive, and so as well as Societe Generale in France. And I remember in the last Ultra report, you had the collapse of Bank of America and Citibank being a temporal marker for unemployment of 55% in the U.S. Is that still something that it's a possibility?
Oh, certainly, yes. Not only possible, it's baked into the cake at this point. It's unavoidable. If there's a bumble through and we avoid a massive level of degradation of our social infrastructure via natural disasters from the sun or elsewhere, and we are able to overcome that, those things that we face over these next couple of years, we're still at the very first beginning days of a massive global depression that is related to the dollar and its death as a global reserve currency. So 55% or much greater levels of unemployment. Bear in mind that our employment structure at the moment is terribly skewed. All of the numbers coming from the officialdom have fake birth and death societal growth numbers and behavioral difference numbers and delta this, and all of it's made up by a bunch of people in government, and I used to be one of them, who helped contribute to making up those numbers. And I kid you not, it is a whole process involved, and the numbers themselves have no basis in reality. I worked for an organization that was a state government agency that contributed to the national economic numbers. And frequently we would present real data, and the supervisors above us, for whatever agenda purpose they had, would tell us to go and rework the numbers, basically come back with numbers that they wanted. And so from then on, I've never trusted any kind of government work. And here we have an unemployment picture that is, unfortunately, at a macro level, if you examine how money is flowing, going towards a mega government employment. And when the government, which is supported by its primary product, the dollar, goes through this huge upheaval, we will see massive levels of layoffs at a government level. And we're seeing them in a hidden way now. So, for instance, over 30,000 students were laid off of the federally supported food stamp program, but it's actually paid for by the states because the states are going broke. In this state, and then in another state, you're going to get another 30 or 40,000. These people have to be considered as part of this group of laid off individuals because they were basically supported by the dole at a level that's akin to whatever we would see in Rome or ancient Rome or, current Britain in that sense. We just called it student aid or food stamps or this kind of thing. But basically it's government support in a dole fashion. And when they get laid off, that's when we've got serious problems. And that starts this fall, I believe.
Thanks, Cliff. Green Meadow.
Hi, Cliff. I had a question about, we had the peaks and crashes, and you said that the floor was going to be built between July 26th and August 9th.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a pretty eventful time. So what does that floor mean to these building peaks and crashes?
When we ran we're running the spiders now. I've had them in operation since the 15th after scrubbing through the lexicon. And so we have the sums in place now. And what we were looking at was let me give you a monkey mind number to associate. I had thought from the forecast of the intensity that we would be looking at, say, 6. in a numeric reference for intensity value. And we actually ran through something closer to an 8.5. Now, these are not like Richter scale or anything. These are just out of a particular scale of 1 to 100, where we concentrate, where they're weighted by intensity towards the lower numbers. So the single digits are actually quite eventful. And as you say, it's been an eventful period. So this floor is going to elevate us out of the projections that we'd originally had in that last shape report. In other words, between now and the 31st of August and the beginning of the building tension that occurs in September was likely to be much more eventful than we'd forecast, and even much more eventful than we'd seen this last week.
Wow. So really this is just the kind of taking off place?
Correct.
Okay.
You could actually say that we're here talking today, and if we could get together in, say, 6 or 8 years, we can say, you remember when we had that conversation back in August? Turns out that was the exact day that the global depression began, or something similar, you know?
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, by the way, the whole thing with Bank of America we detailed years ago because we kept getting these hits on the Bank of Sicily, which is what Bank of America used to be named when it was originally formed in California. And so this is playing out as expected. And as a temporal marker for the background stuff, it's really large.
Sure is. Lenny.
Hi, Cliff. I have a question that Richard Sauter, one of our members, wrote, and it's multifaceted, yet it's short. So the question is there an upcoming Soviet-style governmental collapse in Washington, D.C., with a loss of federal control by the central government in the USA? The other one is, does the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank go belly up, ditto for the IRS, and when does the U.S. Federal Reserve / IRS system outright fail and become irrelevant?
The irrelevancy, let's start from the end and work back. The irrelevancy is clearly shown by November of 2012. No one cares anymore. The language just faded rapidly. Even in our years ago in our long-range projection, we kept coming up with the Fed would be irrelevant in November. We just couldn't put the date on it until we'd really tuned over the time. So I wouldn't say that the Fed or the IRS fail. I would say they are removed or disempowered or however, okay, repudiated or something like that. It's not that they're not going to fail of their own weight. They're doing things that are causing their own demise. That's quite clear. But that demise will come as an act of will, basically, on the part of the people that they're trying to subjugate. When that will occur, will probably be in the early part of 2012 based on the release values. That would place it in March to May. Whether it takes the IRS down then or not, IRS is becoming basically moot after the post office goes anyway. You have to understand the intricacies of the relationship between the ability of the federal government to wire transfer money around and the services that the post office provides. If that's all they're going to do as a background and handle all the security stuff, they'll be renamed. It'll be a different structure entirely. And we'll still have all of the problems relative to the dollar that will be exposed by the bankruptcy. It's kind of as though, most people don't know it, but the United States Post Office is a screen for what could be the giant wire fraud of all time. And they're the ones that prosecute wire fraud and define it. So it's an interesting set of circumstances that will emerge between now and the 31st with our blue bankruptcy that are going to lead us to a whole lot of different questions. And what I'm basically said with the intensity values is that a lot of our forecasts are now going to be superseded by events, overtaken. Because I can forecast, for instance, say I get a 0 to a 10 reading and we get a 6. Well, then I can say, okay, in the subject of social context change, a 6 is, from previous history, the outcoming of all of the illegal immigrants in the United States demanding rights. And we can project that. And so I can say, in a financial area, a 6 is now equivalent to or greater than the financial problems of 2008 and the mega bailouts. And I know now that I was light. We should have been projecting something like an 8.5, which we have yet to encounter. Make sense?
Makes sense. I'm still thinking about the IRS and the post office. I guess I just didn't realize that they were connected.
The United States Post Office, through all these various different, they were the first into the wire transfer. They're the ones that support the services for finding out who's doing fraudulent wire transfers. They monitor vast quantities of money movement throughout the United States. They provide the backbone for the states to move money through the various federal programs to the states and back and forth, revenue and so on. It's huge. At one point, I had been told they were moving $2 billion an hour through their system.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Hi, Clif. You mentioned in the last report in September the cascading failure is forecast for September, warning of an accident that causes systems, internet issues that has the potential for a worldwide girdling. It becomes a cascading failure. Could this be due to sun issues, and what is that, and how have you got any more data on that?
I haven't gotten into the interpretation. We've got a very large, let me back up. I haven't gotten into interpreting the individual data points, but the collection bag for those data points relative to the solar activity is very large. It then continues to grow as the spiders continue to fill it. So we expect that indeed we'll find there is a great deal of new information about solar activity. I suspect that the cascades this fall and into winter, at least one of them is clearly described by connection to the Terra event or Terra entity through crosslinks as being related to natural disaster hitting the U.S., which I suspect will be triggered by solar activity directly or indirectly. So a very large series of earthquakes could indeed be solar related, especially with the CME activity and the solar or the high energy particles and all the other crud we're getting from the sun at the moment. And it's been quite clear that we're as a species, we've got to re-examine our relationship with our environment and the sun and what it's going to do. We have, for instance, extremely hot day here right at the moment. But when I got up this morning, it was so cold I needed to wear a watch cap for my bald head. So we're talking below 50 degrees ambient temperature, and yet now it's in the upper 80s, moving into the 90s perhaps. They've had chemtrails all day. We still are a month and a half behind on the production of some of the berries that we expect. In terms of local produce, we've had a miserable series of crops this year, all the way through our non-existent spring, and then we hit a reasonably hot period, and everything is wilting, and a lot of plants are showing damage from the sudden burst of heat. So this level of solar activity can be expected to increase. Patrick Garrell's intensity numbers seem well placed, if slightly off, and I have a variant factor that would explain that. If we wanted to divert there for a minute, it's an issue of as the sun continues to wind up in the final days, each of the windings take longer to do because there's so much more tension within the mass itself, very much as though we were trying to wind a string around a top and increasingly applied more tension as we went along. And so that's what accounts for the shift in it. And yes, I expect in October we're going to get really hit down.
And I was assuming, because of analyzing, I think I sent you an email on it, I noticed that the X-flares happened in between the Patrick Garrell cycles. So obviously between January 18th and April 15th, the X-flares happened in mid-February, and the same thing here. So do you think it's more likely that the big X-flares happen in the middle of the cycle as opposed at the end of the cycle itself?
Oh, certainly. We've known that since August 1 of 2010, where we had that screwiness on the sun, and then had a series of flares about 18 or 20 days later that began at that point. So I agree with you. That is indeed an accurate observation. I think also, though, that if we look at the plot on that we're seeing a slight increase in the length of the time of the cycle. So it may not actually work out that it's going to be October 25 or 26 this year. It may be November 1 or 2, and we have the second of our cascades is in early November. That's the one that's more Terra associated than the other two. It may be a masking issue, though, the way we had with the Peterson quake sort of masking the larger Sumatran tsunami that particular year. And I can't really differentiate at this point. We'll know more by our September 1 report, which will sort of give us a heads up.
Fantastic.
Hi, Cliff. This is Chipper Dog. I would be really curious to know if the frequencies of the light that the sun is sending and we're receiving are changing due to those winding magnetics you were just talking about, or some other set of causes.
I can't say that the the winding itself is obviously going to alter the way in which photons are released from the sun, but there may be an underlying cause that is perhaps more pronounced, that's being magnified by the windings, because we know now that there's 4 interior spheres to the sun that are noticeable in terms of how we can track the various internal movements. And the photonic band appears to come from the second one down, which I don't know that that's going to be impacted directly by the winding. But nonetheless, the sun the actinic rays are way up, and the plants are burning, and, skin cancer rates are escalating. But we also see a new archetype coming out where we're going to start seeing sun protective features in clothing, and they'll start selling those and saying, super lightweight, you won't sweat, but hey, look at this, SPF 12,000 or something.
Kind of like that old Ray-Ban commercial with the robes and the sunglasses.
Indeed, yes, exactly, yeah. All updated, of course, but yeah.
It's almost like they were telling us right then in that one commercial what was happening.
Hey, look way back. There's this weird, or not weird, there is a very strange imprint that's been put into a commercial series that was carried for year after year, and even at the detriment, even at the cost of not increasing sales. And it was for these transition lenses, these
right.
Polychromatic plastic lenses that change with intensity of photons.
Right.
And if you'll notice,
you can get those for your cataract surgery if you want.
No, I'd rather not even discuss that. But I mean, George is affected that way. But my point is, if you look at those commercials way back when, they're talking about clothing that changed relative to the intensity of the sun, and you see people going out in the commercial outside their little protective hives, and all of their clothing and everything changing to reflect the sunlight, and how the sun is so intense and everything is hugely white, and it wasn't a yellow sun at all. And those ads appeared way back when, so they've been telling us for years that this was coming.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Sure.
Diane Vici.
Hi, Cliff.
Hello.
Question I have is, does the data still have 2 large earthquakes in North America for the middle of August, possibly around the 18th?
I think 17th and 18th and 19th is when I'm expecting it, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Don't like that. It's not a good thing in the sense it's going to cause some disruption, and I expect a lot of problems from one of the earthquakes relative to the bridges, because the other temporal markers that were part of that chain have already fallen, so we're just waiting for that rather expectantly. And poor old Igor is chewing his mustache right off. He's up in earthquake country at the moment in Alaska.
It's like one of them was supposed to affect the middle of America, basically cut us off from one side, at least what I've...
Correct. But we could have misread that in the sense it may not be east-west, it might be north-south. So it might be an earthquake that separates a major north-south artery, which would slice the part of the America in half. So it could be the eastern corridor north-south, could be a western corridor north-south, or a central corridor north-south that could be affected.
Well, that's different. Well, thank you.
Sure.
Cliff,
by the
I'd
way,
like to ask a follow-up question on that sun issue. In the reports, you've got data going to people who are not afraid of the sun and even embrace its energy. Are these people muckers? How are they able to
No, these individuals, sorry, I'm just, I get all whipped up about this particular subject because it's really cool, but the indications we had for that subset are more greatly supported in the Terra entity and in the Space Goat Fart entity than any of the others, but they have a presence in America, or in Populous USA and Global Pop, and also in Future Pop. And in Future Pop, these guys were something of a healer class, not physicians by any means at all, but if you will, vibratory templates. No, the individuals are described as being able to, or being exceptional. So we're talking about people that would be, say, standout, one in a million kind of an individual thing, maybe even one in several millions. And these people are able to exhibit the city, and I think that this is, I've done some research on it recently and gone back and read in the Science of Yoga, and indeed there is one where there are people that can basically be described as energetic batteries. They sit around and There you go. But they're able to pass it on to other beings. So they sit there and, if you will, concentrate the solar key force, and then they go about dropping it on those people that need it and brightening their day.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. That's exciting. So they're not muckers.
No, it's at the same level of disruption to the social order, though, and the powers that be actually would support the muckers a lot more than these individuals, because it's going to blow a whole lot of theories of how the universe works right out of the woodwork, I think.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Chipper. And by the way, I'm a bit suspicious now. Cliff, you've been saying for the last 3 months Igor's been chewing his mustache off. I'm surprised he's still got some mustache on.
No, you'd have to know his lineage. He's one of those guys that he's Germanic in his roots, and he has that sort of short, bristly, almost reddish hair, but not quite. So no, it's tough stuff. I'm surprised myself. His teeth will probably give out first.
Okay, too much information. Pass it over to Green Meadow.
Hi there.
Hello.
More and more it seems that many of the forecasts have language fulfillment, and then in the following years the same forecast is fulfilled again but larger. For example, the summer of hell and flooding. Can you tell when something is a pre-echo and will swing around again more intensely?
A little bit more now than in past. It's a very difficult call to make because there is a general trend to always have certain mega sets continuing to gain data, partially because we can't throw out enough. So for instance, there will always be people out there that have a fundamentalist view of the planet, will, even in the best of times, will be out spewing that the world is ending. And so we will always collect doom and gloom data that the world's going to end and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that set is always active. That has a tendency to obscure the larger growth of these sets. So we don't see them in profile, if you will. We see them end on. And so we look and we see a tube of 4 inches in diameter, and we can't really tell that there's a smaller tube 2 inches in diameter that's within our view because we're looking down the hole from both tubes. Make any sense at all?
Okay, yeah, actually it does. I think we're all still trying to figure out how to read your work, including you probably.
Oh, correct. We're having to cope with new conditions constantly. So the fact that we've gotten anywhere close to where we're at is really staggering. I never thought it would be this successful.
I'm pretty amazed by it. I think it's wonderful. Can you tell us what you expect for each crashing peak?
I can't really. I can tell you that the crashcade in the middle, which we think is associated with the early part of November, just slightly prior to the 12th, so it would be like the 11th and the 12th. We know that that one has more of a Terra entity and a space goat farts association, which brings in the unknown energies from space, as well as the sun, than any of the others. But coincidentally, we have that whole Elenin business in October, so the emotional peak of that in early November sort of might make sense in a screwy way. I haven't really wrapped my head around that, but that's the only one that we have any real definition for, other than we have a preponderance of nasty financial and nasty political language in the December crashcade. The October crashcade has an ever so slightly larger amount of financial information involved in it than otherwise, but the period of time that it takes us to descend from the emotional peak to the emotional floor is so short that there is there's just not a lot of data in the transition period of time. It's unlike the period of time when we went into 63 days of release language, which was a continuing trend that we could see a number of years even out. What we have here is a real straight, sudden drop-off. So I don't know what that means, but it's worrisome that we're in this particular point of the financial system. So if I had to say we were going to face a crisis, I would lay it out and say, okay, my monkey mind could see equity crises on a massive scale in October, followed by bond crises of unparalleled nature early November, and the bond market being hugely larger than the equity market and all the gold and other thing markets brings down the petrodollar, and we have a political crisis that might involve rioting of those people that are politically afflicted in early December. That's probably the best sort of a description I can give you in terms of, but that's monkey mind. It could just as easily be, in October we get a brush by of something that we think is sentiently controlled, and that brings out the crash of the church in October, and it exposes all of the corruption of the global elite, and that initiates the financial crisis in November, and we see the global revolution in the mass hangings and the murders of the formerly oppressors in early December. Those are the kinds of intensity values we have.
Okay. Can you give like a percentage of how much something is Terra and how much something is markets?
Relative to the totality, I can give you some indication, yes. You have to understand that we start off with a background of zero, of neutral for these values. And so it's not as though everything that contributes to a set provides impetus up or down. So they may conflict with each other. So for instance, some of the sets within the space goat farts might bring in a negative intensity. They're laid back, so to speak. Others bring in a positive intensity. So just the fact that the space goat fart is itself predominant in a set is not quite as meaningful as it might seem to be. So just because we have a predominance of markets in October is not quite as meaningful as in fact, it's nowhere near as meaningful as the preponderance of the space goat farts with the crashcade in November, because the data being brought in by markets in October is so frothy that we can't get any real clear determination as to what's going on. But that itself may be meaningful to those people that are in the markets. Okay. So let's look at October. In October, we have a slight preponderance of about 6 to 7% of markets. In November crashcade, we have a combined preponderance of the entities Terra and Space Goat Fart, discounted by weight, of about 14 to 15%. And then back in the December period of time, we have a huge mishmash of political, financial, and religious that are each adding about a total of, say, 2 to 3 to 4% of the weight, but no more than 4%.
Okay, that's confusing. I mean, it's details, but it's not making sense at this end of the timeline.
Correct. That's why I say it's not necessarily meaningful.
Yeah. So do you have any temporal markers that you're personally looking for, that we should be looking for as a possible sign that, everything's about to go kaplooey?
Some of them are showing up now. The shift of a lot of things in India, and certain movements in Russia, as well as the riots in China. One of the things that had been a big indicator for us would be the escalation of riots within China this year, and we've seen as much social disorder and as much effort put by the powers that be in China to suppress social unrest in the first 4 months of this year as we saw in all of last year. And so now we're actually have seen as much so far this year as in the last 3 years. And in 2010, there were 70,000 riots. In 2009, these are officially noted riots or incidents. And in 2009, there were 86,000. So this year, we've seen over 150,000 social disruption incidents, which is all an outgrowth of how the corruption, if you will, of the fiat currency is working its way through their social system. So that temporal marker has been a very big one. And then I have some personal contact with some highly placed Chinese individuals, including one fellow who is clearly a billionaire, and he is exiting China. That's another large temporal marker. So the global rev and all of that, well underway, it's progressing. It's merely a question of how soon it gets to you. The call we had made in the last SHAPE report for the launch in Britain, it was precisely on. It was within our time frame. So in that level of the whole discussion. I don't see any reason to change our projection that we'll see riots soon, probably before or around the equinox in Italy. They'll be related to the food riots that will take down the Vatican, and that may be as early as October. And from then on, that's my next large major temporal marker has to, well, there's a bunch of them, but they have to do with the activity coming out of the Vatican.
Wow, we live in interesting times.
Oh, amazing, amazing. You couldn't have asked for better, you know? Too bad we couldn't have scripted or written it down.
I'm not bored, yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Cliff, speaking about the global rev, when will the riots hit the US, and will they be as eventful as the UK riots?
The very disturbing part of it all now is the shift in the U.S. is mirroring what has happened in the U.K. relative to how law enforcement is reacting. So I think that it will be much worse here. We're much more heavily armed. We won't be rioting with baseball bats. There will be a lot of bullets flying around. The question will be whether or not the officialdom and minions can push out the power of the U.S. military onto U.S. citizens. They're doing everything they can now in the language to demonize the citizenry, to both the law enforcement, the militarized ones, the SWAT teams, everybody that's been trained by the FBI in the last 20 years, as well as the military themselves. You'll note that they no longer refer to people as citizens of the United States. The military is now handing out, the U.S. military is now handing out and preparing to hand out, distribute fairly widely, I guess, descriptor cards that basically lay out who you are in our social order. And that's a prelude to the imposition of military control of the civilian populace, because they now view us as terrorists. So we see trends in these last 4 years here in the U.S. that mirror what happened in the U.K. The U.K. was early. David Icke was out there railing about it years ago because he could see it occurring all around him. And basically what it was the militarization of the police to the point where the police saw the citizenry as the perpetrators and therefore had a natural reluctance to come out on crimes, because they saw everybody involved with crime as a participant, including the so to speak the victims. And so now we see the fascist rise of that same attitude here in the U.S. and the natural consequences, where you don't wear your seatbelt, so they taser you and kick your ribs in because you're a perpetrator of an evil crime, and it just goes on and on and on. Now this has shifted, we know, from the historical reference of in the U.S. to those individuals that used to wear badges as peace officers who had the discretion to just keep the peace. That was what they were there for, all the way up through now law enforcement, and real soon, I'm not going to state my guesses as to how they're going to relabel it, but real soon, probably by November 1, you'll see us start relabeling in the U.S. those people that we now call the law enforcement community, and it won't be a good thing. So, yes, they're going to try and do that. Will it work? I just don't know.
Cliff, this is Lenny. When you were talking, I was wondering if you were talking about the descriptor cards, if that's like a single unique identifier, like a chip or a biometric.
No. These are more like what they would hand out to troops in an occupying country that would identify people by tribal garb, so to speak, and let them know what tribe they're in and how much hassle and whether they're friendly, unknown, or disfriendly.
So is that kind of like racial profiling in a way?
But it's going to be social, because I think you'll see that they'll probably try and include archetypes like homeless people and welfare people and so on at that level of social categorization, such that the individuals that are tasked with maintaining order. Now I'm stressing those words for a real reason. But for maintaining order on behalf of the powers that be, will know who they can do what to with what level of impunity.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to wear a white gown.
Well, okay, there you go. Well, I mean, okay, this is an interesting subject, as a matter of fact. Those little bits of data, and I've got to say that, I'm as frail and weak as an individual as anybody else, right? So I fire up model space, and we've got the spiders dumping stuff in, and you get some flashy bits there, and you can't help it. The coffee's giving you up. You don't have any pie at the moment, so you're going to go mess about with the model space and just see what that little flashy bit was, because it was an intriguing hue or color. And I've done a little bit of that prior to getting into the interpretation with a serious bit of work here probably into next week. But in any event, one of the things I did see was that there's a developing trend. Well, two things actually. This huge archetypical shift that's occurring, which we can talk about later, but this really interesting trend relative to dress and face. And before we'd had the information about the bad makeup and how that was going to cause problems, and that's still building and pending, so it's real close, I think. But also now we've got an interesting thing, which I'm going to call changeable facial tattoos. And apparently there's going to be a backlash or outgrowth against facial recognition software, as we're seeing being used in the London riots. And so people will start purchasing pre-manufactured, probably underground to start with, and then someone will really catch on. But they're pre-manufactured like iron-on or apply face paint that will be specifically designed to thwart facial recognition software. And some of it will include, splashy glitters and other things to distort camera images. So we can look forward to this in our long slew of people wearing masks, memes that are coming out. Now, we know that this is a wide meme, and it is continuing to grow. So going to be real interesting.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Won't be white. You'll probably go down to the local 7-Eleven and buy some under-the-counter facial recognition software thwarting tattoos.
Yeah.
Cliff, can I ask a follow-on to that? Do you see anything in your data that would indicate an electronic masking of any sort?
Sure, but I'm not going to discuss it.
Okay. All right.
Hi, Cliff. I've got a question here from Bix Weir, who's a follower of your work as well.
Sure, yeah,
Hi,
I know
Cliff.
Bix, yeah.
Yep. Hi, Cliff. My work has long forecast the total destruction of all electronic and paper assets, as well as debt, around the world with the implosion of the global derivative complex. I see two paths the people of the United States can take when this crash culminates. The first hands over all our freedoms to the powers that be, with the majority of us turning into debt slaves under another unbacked fiat monetary system. The second returns us to our constitutional gold and silver monetary system, and we are able to start fresh under new leadership. What kind of monetary system does the Webbot see in a post-crash America, or will there be so many other problems and issues that it becomes less relevant? Thanks, Bix.
It's less relevant, but we actually see both. They're not mutually exclusive. One must precede the other, and we have to go through the attempted imposition of slavery in order to turn the with the time and flow with the go, if you will. We're at a particular unique point of history. We're seeing the destruction of a civilization that has been the culmination of the last 13,000 years, that is based on a bunch of abstractions and illusions, or abstractions that are illusions, and also based on a bunch of assumptions that are illusions, all of which are going to be totally taken away from us as mind props, if you will. So we must, as a necessity, go through all of these events. That's why I'm trying to basically just sort of chill out and let it all happen and stand back from it, because everybody's going to have to get really whipped up in order to understand that it was all meaningless, and we can go on and get on with the real work of turning us into a Class 1 civilization. But unfortunately, there's this little period of time where we have to be upset of things. So, yeah, it will be the imposition of the slavery, though. That's what they're trying right now. The question is, well, will it work? I don't know. I don't think so, because we have some hints that it doesn't, but we'll live through to see it, I guess.
Interesting, Cliff. And to all the dogs barking, it sounds like a full moon out today.
These are our security services. They're just a little overzealous.
That's very true. It's not just yours, by the way, Cliff. It's a number of our guests here. They're very much dog lovers. The next question is from Diane VG.
Hi, Cliff. Okay, we're moving on to global pop. And my question is in regards to those of us who dare to live recklessly by staying, say, in Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, the West Coast. Do you see anything Terra-specific to the U.S. or the Pacific Plate cracking indicating that we should take off and get out of Dodge? And if so, do you have a time frame? The reason I'm asking this, hang on, so you understand, the reason I'm asking is because some of us don't have the financial means to quit our jobs and head to higher altitudes or build a boat even. Living beyond paycheck to paycheck is a real bitch and pushes one to learn how to rely on the universe to provide when one can no longer financially provide for themselves.
I fully understand, and that's why I'm very, very, very hesitant to answer this, because people might take it wrong and do that and place themselves at even greater financial risk and personal risk when not necessary. We always have to acknowledge that everybody's destiny is their own. And I have personally seen this, okay? I've lived through things that should have killed me. And others have been greatly injured around me, and I've come through unscathed, and there's no rhyme nor reason for that. So the universe participates at a level that we cannot second guess. That having been said, yes, we've got earthquakes that we've got coming up. We've got some degrading environment, and we have these nasty bastards out there that have deliberately poisoned the Gulf. And I have a very personal association with this through Kathy and our niece here, who has an infant and is going to be returning to the Gulf. And it's like, if anything, I would prefer that she not, simply because I know the kind of chemical problems that are going on. Plus, we also have to acknowledge that, the powers that be, are expecting it to escalate. The reason I say that is because they're waging this war against Gulf whistleblowers that need not exist unless they're planning for part 2. And so I think there's something else that they've got planned in that region that, I have some foreboding of it. We don't have any data science for it, but the actual analysis of what's going on leads me to think that the powers that be are mucking about a little bit more than they should be, given what they've already accomplished. Then, yes, we see very large disruptions occurring now in the Pacific Ocean that cannot be explained by our current level of understanding about oceanographic science. So, for instance, Richard Sauter is reporting the same things we're seeing here. He sent me an email saying that the beaches are closed in Ecuador because of excessively high tides, something to do theoretically with wind and excessively large waves. We've got a weird situation where the lunation should not be causing the depth or the height of the tide level we have here at the far end of Puget Sound. We're a very high tide region. We have a daily swing at about 13 feet near where I live, but yet we've been doing 15 feet these last couple of days, and it makes no sense at all given what's going on with the moon. So absent any other causal effect for that, I'm at the moment putting it down to what we're also seeing out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and I've got reports from all kinds of islanders as well as the science data coming in through NOAA and some of the other places. And I think probably Stan Deo, he tracks the heat maps of the Pacific Ocean, so he's probably also seeing it. But there's some excessively odd activity that's occurring from Midway Island in an arc that goes down to the Marquesas and then arcs back over towards Chile. What that activity is masked by the symptoms at this point. But it could well be that our Pacific Plate crack is developing. Now, does that mean we should head for the hills? I don't know of any hills that would be of any use to head to unless you're right on the coast. If you're in Crescent City, Oregon, and you hear there's a tsunami coming and it's because of an undersea earthquake in the Pacific, yeah, that would make sense to get out of Dodge and get into those hills. Same thing with La Push and Washington, or even perhaps some of the islands up here, San Juan Islands, get a little bit higher elevation. But if you're in Florida, it's not going to make any difference. And I don't think we're talking anything like Patrick Darrell's fear of planet-crossing waves, even from something as large as the Pacific Plate cracking, because there are certain theoretical and actual physical measured heights of tsunamis that just have not ever been exceeded. So we kind of have a clue that even if the Pacific Plate cracks, we're maybe looking at 200 or 300 feet maximum wave height in some particular points where the beach supports it. But other areas, we're back to the same kind of thing that the Sumatran tsunami. So Hawaii is at danger and so on. I would be paying attention to what happens in that particular arc, but I don't know that I would let it motivate me to flee. And especially since there's, all of the financial issues. I mean, that hits everybody. I've got doing everything I can to come up with funding to keep a couple of kids working just because they're at risk and they need money. And it's that way all over. This is basically Appalachia up here in the West Coast. It's going to be very, very dire, but we're looking at the beginning of the recession, not its end, not its middle.
Oh, I think we've been in the recession for a very long time. It's affected me personally for 2.5 years. So I see people talking about, oh, we're not in a recession, and I want to laugh in their face. Oh, really? Come to my house.
Yes. Happy days are here again.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I remember all those. And yeah. No, we've got no recovery, and it's all an illusion in the minds of the politicos. The reality of it is that we've got to start opting out. Use the phrase of the kids and go off grid, but basically opt out of the dollar system if you want to eliminate its ability to influence your life. And it's a hard thing to do, but it can be done.
Yeah. I did want to make one mention because a lot of y'all are not on the East Coast or on the East Coast beach. About a week ago, I was watching the news and they panned over the beach in my city. And there was no waves whatsoever. And I've never seen our beach with absolutely no waves. It looked like a lake. It was weird.
That's very odd, yes.
I've never seen that. Anyways, just thought I'd mention that.
It scared the hell out of me, yeah.
I'm sorry. So the next question I have is from J.S. Earhart, and it's, is there anything in your data that shows when, in specific or even a relative time frame, the middle class becomes non-existent, such as the rich and poor medieval time like? And how long will that last before the total collapse of the current power structure?
I'd have to peg that at being a part of our March to May period of next year. That's when we'll see the largest impact on the middle class in the U.S. relative to the degradation of the social order and the underpinning of the dollar and the political order and TV and, the just-in-time delivery system and movies and all of that sort of thing. We're at it now, though. I mean, it's just been a huge collapse of our social structure to where 25 years ago, 12% of the populace was basically the ruling class, and now it's less than 1% and shrinking. So we're at a very dangerous level in historical terms. But March of next year, that's when the middle class just starts to fade away. How long will it last? I don't know. And I don't know that the terms will be meaningful. The middle idea of a middle class is only meaningful if you're in the aristocracy. If you live in a different social structure, you need not have a hierarchical division of the humans who live around you. And so personally, I would like to live in a world where we didn't have classes and we were just all out there exploring and basically out causing problems for a universe in a more or less organized fashion that we all agree on. So, but the middle class issue, it goes away in 2012, and I don't think it's going to be a meaningful term in 2014 if we looked at that old data.
See, I agree with you. I'm not into this whole structure of money. It doesn't make sense. Too many people are miserable.
I know. Well, also, we have to look at the real reality of it. When money goes away, all that has disappeared is an abstraction. Not a single apple has left the planet. Not a single iota of energy has gone from the planet, and so on and so on and so on. Plus, let's look at some weird things about money at the moment. Let's divert for a bit of current history, probably ongoing as we speak, and will probably contribute to the events that will continue through to August 31 relative to the fiscal structure of the planet. In 2001, on September 10, Donald, the egregious pimp, Rumsfeld, comes out and announces that $2.2 trillion is missing from the Pentagon's budget, and, shucks and by golly, we just don't know where it went. We're just not even going to look for it. It's just too much, and we just can't find it. And then 2008, $6.42 trillion disappeared from the global economy, basically from the United States. 6.42 trillion, so an escalation from 2 trillion to 6 trillion over just those few years. And right now we have the curious little situation where they go through the theater entirely hooked up by them of the debt ceiling, and then the day afterwards they draw down that credit card to its maximum level at the same time that the rumors are swirling that the Federal Reserve is calling in every note it put out in the bailout money of the $16 trillion to the foreign central banks. If we take that in total, that would be $32 trillion available to be looted. I wonder how much of that's going to disappear from our global system. See, we think here, from an analysis of what's going on in the background, that the looting of the global system is a sure sign of the imminence of the collapse. And the escalation from 2 to 6 to now potentially 32 shows basically a parabolic escalation. We've reached the knee of the curve. And so we're probably within that period of time, let's just say this year, that the whole system comes unglued because it has been looted. And it's kind of a situation that the Maasai face. These are these guys in Africa that drink blood from cows. And it's forced on them by their environment. I don't find it particularly appetizing, but they survive on it. But you got to be able to know how to bleed the cow such that the poor old cow just doesn't keel over on you. But at some point, the cow may get so old or decrepit, you don't worry about that. And I think the black ops guys are at that point, that the people that are looting the system have just decided, oh, it's going down anyway, so let's take out the last we can.
Yeah, I had one more question that goes along with that. It's in regards to the predictions of the economy crashing. Mm-hmm. And for the past several years, people have been rushing out to buy gold and silver as a backup to worthless paper. And my thoughts, wouldn't this still be a materialistic game where who holds the most money wins, regardless of what form the money is in? Like
that's true. That's true.
Like like a shift to precious metals would still be playing in the hands of powers that be because they still have most of it. I mean, some people have been able to get their hands on it, but it's not nearly as much.
Let's say that you're quite correct. It's 100% true of your statement, but there's an underlying assumption there that you just sort of gloss over without even really thinking about, and that is that they would be able to hold on to it.
I see.
See, so yes, there's about to be and we're participating in right now the greatest wealth transfer in history, as we transfer all of the wealth out of the paper debt instruments into a very small and narrow market, clearly defined basically in terms of its portability by the precious metals, and we can just say that gold and silver dominate those, and there's no point in discussing platinum, rhodium, and the others. And those precious metals are going to be it's very interesting to look at it at a mega economic level. For instance, there's more people on the planet than have ever been ounces of gold extracted from the ground in our current civilization. If we take the work of Tellinger and the gold mining in South Africa, it's quite clear that the vast majority of the planet's gold has been removed from the planet's surface, doesn't exist on our planet anymore. And as a result, our gold is a very precious resource because the assays where they would say that gold was 0.2% of the crust were based on the crust of the Earth now and not the way it used to be. But when that wealth transfer takes place, we have had data for probably close to a decade suggesting that the ability to possess large amounts of wealth in very few small hands is going to be severely tested. Now, we never have really any clear indication of the outcome, but even now we're getting legal indications, such as the people of India basically have done a huge wealth transfer of billions of dollars from the supposed Indian royalty to the populace as a whole. So that kind of thing is going to go on all over the place, and the royals are going to just be left wondering, hey, what happened there?
So other people are going to get a hold of the gold, pretty much.
Correct.
Okay. Because, I was wondering, in my thoughts, materialism is not the way to go. So any type of fiat currency, to me, seems redundant. Like we're going to keep repeating the same patterns.
I agree with you. And that's why our description of the economics that arise after the May of 2013 peak of the solar activity, and also the bubble for us relative to the hard stop on our data. But our old long-term data had always pointed to a calorie-based economy that was basically, if one wanted to have a historical context, more related to, say, Middle Ages Japan than anything we have currently, where the farmers are revered because of their ability to produce excess food and feed more than themselves. And from that point on, your whole social order takes that as its underpinning, and off they go. But without the squirreliness of the current situation of the farmer structure in Japan, more like the old days of the pre-samurai even. And so the calorie economy uses as its ability to transmit excess calories, a temporary store, if you will, the gold and the silver, which are, in a sense, a currency, but not a fiat. And they have meaning because it takes energy to extract them from the soil. And your economy can grow, for instance, in a gold-backed economy, you grow every time you have a gold rush and you discover more gold, and everybody beats their brains out and extends all those calories to get it out of the ground, and so it has real meaning, unlike paper. Now, a curious thing is that in the long-term data from like 2004 or 5 or 6, I forget when we actually got it, we had this picture of a future pop that was out in 2041 in which there's this, basically I'd have to describe it as like a planetary catastrophe or crises, not necessarily catastrophe, but crises, in which it is necessary that a continent-wide effort be made to concentrate the social agenda of what we now call the United States. And in that social order, the local, all across the nation of the people that lived there at that time end up being basically a giant gifting society, and everybody gifts their gold to the collective for whatever the need of it is. And it's not to back paper, it's not a fiscal thing, it's some kind of a use of the gold, a need for the gold metal itself. So it was just a curious sort of a thing that it appeared as though gifting as a social structure would be more prevalent from the 20s onward.
Well, that would be a nice way to see things go. And I don't want to hog up all your time, so.
Sure, yeah, no worries.
Thank you very much for that answer.
Turd, you had a question for Clif?
On in the collection or the purchase of physical metal, and why folks seem to be going in that direction. It's been in my experience with the site and visiting with people around the globe. It's really for two reasons. It's one, it's as a potential unit of barter, kind of like what Clif is talking about. If there becomes a time for, based off a natural disaster or just the collapse of the currency or economic collapse, that you have this traditionally and historically accepted unit of value that you can barter for goods and services if fiat is no longer accepted. So it's an insurance policy for that. The other reason that people are buying precious metals is in anticipation of whatever the next international, unit of currency will be. Is that once this fiat system, this Keynesian-based system, is proven to be comes to its natural end, that the world will turn back to some type of incontrovertible natural resource or hard asset-based currency. And the idea is that you can take your fiat money today and turn it into a hard asset, some gold or silver, to store the value of all your hard work that you have today, and then ultimately convert it back into whatever that new currency will be. So I just want to add that the question was, why are people doing this? And it's been my experience, it's those two reasons.
And basically, too, just speaking to that last, we have huge social orders now on this planet. Giant, India, for instance, there's a mega economy based on the little gold leaves that the women purchase and the farmers purchase as their storehouse of calories going forward into the future. There's an economy that is based on the trading of those in the form of dowry and daily trading. And they actually make a lot of sense because it's a personal way of having your wealth with you, doesn't involve banks, and so on and so on. So it's basically a large power issue at that level if you have the ability to control your own destiny. So the whole statement of honest money and all of the appellations that have been used relative to gold and silver over time are true, and it has only been since the evil era of Greenspan and Volcker et al. That we've had them try and castigate gold and silver as barbaric relics. And in fact, large areas of our, 1 billion people on this, in this planet right now can be counted on to accept gold and silver without hesitation. And that's the Hindu population. You start looking at the Mongolians and their tradition of all the nomadic people and their trading that way. And pretty soon, if you add it up, probably about a third or greater of the humans on the planet now are dealing daily in what we think of as precious metals. So we're kind of late to the party, really.
Thanks, Turd, and thanks, Cliff. Green Meadow.
Hi, Cliff. This is more back to the global here. The Arab Spring was set off by events in Tunisia and Egypt, and Britain and Ireland seem to be forecast to be heavily featured in the coming global revolution data. Over the last week, London and other cities in England have erupted in riots, looting, and anarchy. It was reported that older youths using BlackBerry Messenger services, where all the messages were encrypted, have been instigating many of the riots, not the usual lower-income, disaffected youths using Facebook and Twitter on cheap mobiles. So that's kind of curious. Also, one of our forum members noticed that August 9th, the third days of these riots, was 33 days prior to September 11th. Does the data show that this is a ritual or plan by the powers that be?
They're participating in it. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if there's the problem. Our data will never be able to explicitly say that the cause of the Arab Spring was the self-immolation of a street vendor. But we do know that events like this, once they begin, are taken over quickly and used for the purposes of the powers that be. So, for instance, we've seen repeated uses of the 33 and double 11s recently. So, for instance, the SEAL team that was brought down was in a helicopter that seats 33 individuals, and so on and so on. I mean, just it's over and over and over again. So they're really seriously working it. So it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing encrypted MI6 technology in the form of the BlackBerries being used to coordinate the London riots, nor is it particularly unexpected to see how the powers that be are responding to them, because I think that their goal would be to take them over for their own purposes, which is to impose greater and greater levels of fascist control, very much like the mythical history that theoretically is the setting for the V movie, where Britain is under a chancellor and a Fourth Reich kind of a thing. We see that occurring. They're attempting to do it everywhere. They're going to use every little tool they possibly can. The question is whether or not they will be overtaken by events. Our data seems to suggest that the events will overtake them and their systems are going to break down much more rapidly than they'd anticipated. We're looking for some changes in how the social unrest will express itself. Now we're entering into a very dangerous phase of time here, and this affects everybody that asks questions and answers them, because real soon we're going to see officialdom start to label answers to questions relative to riots as inducement or incitement to further events down the road. They'll be using them as excuses, so we have to be aware of that and accept the consequences of the discussion of that. And we can, of course, attempt to shield ourselves by saying that we're not recommending violence and all of this kind of stuff. And I will explicitly say that I think violence is stupid, and it plays into the hands of the powers that be, who have schooled themselves in violence for the last 3,000 years. And so wake up, guys, if you're going to be, in global rev, you've got to be really asymmetric about it and not fall into their traps. And it's easy, by the way, to not be violent and still bring the house down. You just have to reconcile yourself to doing a bit of thinking as opposed to simply reacting and letting the hormones take over.
Yeah, one of our other members who lives in the British Islands actually mentioned that the English police response to these riots seemed almost like they were encouraging it, that at other times they've had very strong police forces that really controlled the crowds, and this time they kind of seem to just stand back and permit things or almost encourage things.
They've actually corralled them, if you want to think about it that way. If you look at this as though it were a game of Risk, where they give you the world map and the little plastic pieces and you try and control the planet with your armies, and I don't remember the game that much, but I played it in the past. But if we looked at what's going on in England, it makes sense. If you go up to a 30,000-foot elevation and look down what's going on, they don't want the riots to go out of London. They will sacrifice large parts of major cities in an attempt to keep the riots at this stage contained and not allow the asymmetry of the system, of the situation, to overtake them. So they will actually do as, what's his name? Sun Tzu, in Art of War suggested, and that is to create the valley and, choose the spot where you want the battle to take place. So they'll create opportunity to egg on, if you will, and incite those people such that they can hurt them up. And if you notice what's been going on recently, we've seen that there's a real reason they want them in London. They want to see these people in London because they can see them and record them and then do the facial recognition and arrest them later at their convenience. And also they'll use it as an excuse and be able to say, hey, we've got a video here of you rioting. Whether or not you did or not is immaterial. They don't even have to show it under British law.
Wow. So in the reports, it sounds like events in Ireland and England are going to have echoes throughout the collapse of the Anglo Empire. Is that correct?
They're not echoes. They're going to be like the points that establish the beginning of trends.
Okay. So it's going to end up looking kind of like the Arab Spring thing.
Well, if you want, no, I would say it's unfair to characterize the two as being similar. The root causes may be basically the same: starving people, no opportunity, the collapse of the fiat system, et cetera, et cetera. But the expression of what we're going to see continue through Britain and the Arab Springs are going to be different, probably because of the nature of the environment more than anything, and what the participation of the weather is going to bring into this. And Ireland is its own set of circumstances. The only real reason to discuss them was proximity. And we can't say a lot about the situation that will develop in Ireland because of not wanting to front load or also to place certain individuals at risk, just because we may have, stumbled onto things.
So do you have any advice for people living in the British Islands?
Don't be stupid. Don't be violent.
Okay.
Okay, seriously, these people, I've seen it from the other side. I was a military brat for 17 years. I've seen my father go through the elite schools of the U.S. military and participated in helping him out with the homework and stuff. These people are very, very, very schooled in violence, and unless you've been well trained by 15 or 20 years in a martial arts discipline, you're a fool to even think about going on out and taking part in that sort of an activity. I'm not saying don't be disgruntled and don't take your country back, but I'm saying just be real asymmetric and smart about it. You needn't be violent to be very effective.
Thank you.
This program I would highly recommend. They've had some a terrific hour about time.
That one was amazing.
Wasn't that I had to back it up several times just to re-listen to parts where I went, did I hear that right? It really was thought-provoking. So anyway, through the wormhole.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, I was just listening. Yeah, so what'd they say about time?
I don't know. I'm too tired, I think, to be able to recall too much. It's a fabulous show, though, Cliff. It's on, I think it's the Science Network. This 13-year-old daughter of mine watches it, and it's called Through the Wormhole.
Like with, what's his name? The
Morgan Freeman.
Oh, okay. No, I wasn't thinking of him. Okay. All right, sure. I'll have to check it out. Yeah.
It's hosted by Morgan Freeman, and it goes into some really, really interesting things. And they present it in a way that even the addle-minded such as I can pick it up on it pretty well. So,
this is curious because of a couple of large-scale archetypical shifts that are going on at the moment, and one of them has led me to a very intense interest in time showing up in its visibility component in the media. Because if we examine the previous depressions, going back even all the way back to like 1605, and follow them forward, we see this weird trend of things where every depression in a fiat money system is accompanied by a burst of technological or a spread of technology. Not necessarily the creation of it, but the spread of it, the disbursement of it. So George Ure had the initial part of this. He triggered me over into thinking about it, and I went back and did some research most recently and discovered that the Manhattan Project, being in the 40s, is referenced by the CERN project in the 90s and 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. And the amount of money we've spent relative to CERN dwarfs Manhattan by several orders of magnitude and must be examined on a global scale. So I think time is going to be the next big technology, if you will, or at least that's the idea of the powers that be. That's where they want us to go.
One thing that did come to me, Cliff, that is, as you were talking, was one of the parts of that show. They talked about the rate of radioactive decay and how that was in physics thought to be never changing.
Invariant. Yes,
constant. Yes. And what this researcher had found was that it's not a constant, and it varies based off of incoming solar radiation.
Actually, sure, yeah, I wrote up about that in the whole deal about the rate of decay of carbon-14 because it throws all kinds of stuff into question.
There you go, and the medical implications of it, of chemotherapy or diagnostic tools.
Okay, that's an issue. Are we recording now?
No, We're not. Oh, we are. Oops. Sorry.
We are. Somebody doing the recording?
I'm doing the recording. Yeah.
We got it.
Okay, because this brings up a really curious and very, very pertinent subject. The radioactive decay rate, the Fukushima thing, and the idea of radiation, chemotherapy, and so on. And there's been some suggestion in the data from some time that we're going to, there's all kinds of stuff in there in terms of relative to medical stuff. It's almost as bad as celebrities in terms of the overall level of noise. But I went and did some research and I found that indeed there is a good level of noise around the idea of radioactivity and the scrubbing technologies that we're going to come into. And then curiously, here's a rumor that's been out and about that I came across the other day. The rumor is that the Japanese officialdom has quietly allowed the importation of active hemp oil. Now, not hemp seed oil, but active THC present ingredient hemp oil, with the idea that this stuff will be consumed orally, not smoked, but ingested by little spoonfuls by upper-level officialdom, because it has been shown to be so effective in sweeping radiation from this system in those people that have had chemotherapy and radiation treatment. So the hemp oil is good for you in a lot of different ways, like the flax oil and all of this other stuff in the more raw foods, which we should all be gravitating towards in any event. But there have been some levels of proof, and the fact that the officialdom have clamped down on people like Rick Simpson and others, Heinrich, I forget his name in Sweden, the big proponent for it. But it's like, okay, so now the Japanese, they're not admitting anything, but the officialdom is taking active steps to protect themselves, even doing something that breaks one of the laws that MacArthur put in place. You have to understand how the Japanese social structure has just been so hidebound by the laws that were put in place after World War II, including the laws against the production of marijuana from the hemp plant. And so the fact that they're doing this is a huge temporal marker relative to that. And it also, by the way, says, there's significantly something there if the Japanese government is basically smuggling the stuff into its own people against its own laws.
Well, Clif,
that's incredible.
And Clif, I was about ready to sign off when you came back. I've got about as far as I can go. So this is Turd Ferguson thanking you for the opportunity to visit.
Sure.
And, again, I want to thank the WebBot Forum, too, for including me in the discussion.
Yeah, it's really cool. Very nice of you to join. Yeah.
Thanks, Ted. We're speaking with Clif High. Please support Clif and find out what the collective future may hold at halfpasthuman.com. The next section is Terror and Survival. Lenny.
Hi, Clif. In an email to a forum member earlier this month, you reckoned that it would take 11 months until the molten fuel from Fukushima hits the groundwater or the aquifer. Is that estimate based on WebBot language or the data? And if it's based on other data or information, could you please explain in as much detail as possible about how it works, for example, how the geography of Japan impacts the time it takes for that hot radioactive liquid to reach the aquifers of Asia?
Sure. Yeah, it's in fact a outgrowth of the data set that we had for the ill winds. And at the time that we had the data sets for the ill winds, there was an interpretation of 9 times around the planet. Now, you have to understand how numbers arise and how we have to discard most of them and why we paid attention to that and how easy it is to misinterpret the numbers. So while I thought of it as 9 times around the planet, it probably is better thought of as 9 sources, because we actually have on the planet right at the moment, we've got 9 reactors that are in severe straits, 6 of them in Japan, 2 of them here in the United States, and then one, I forget where it is at the moment. It's just somewhere in Europe. It's long past its lifespan. I think it's one of the French ones, but I'm not sure. Anyway, though, the point being that the Fukushima disaster is still unfolding. We've yet to see even probably the first quarter of it, let alone half of its effect. So I started looking at that because it directly impacts me. We have here our nice little rad meter, and I'm going to turn it on to audio, and we'll just get it in the background. I don't know if you guys can hear it as we're going along, but what I did was to do a Buckminster Fuller style understanding of the continental structure, the remnants of the continental structure of Japan, and what we have yet to face. And basically what they did was they took a questionable design of a GE nuke plant and they reinforced it in the bottom with extra cement on a layer of volcanic soil. All of the descriptions of the Japanese area can be had either from the Japanese government sites or through the UN if you want to go through that way, because the UN does surveys about the nuke plants very extensively, actually. And so you can go all the way back into the 50s there. Some of the data around Fukushima suggest that we'll see a pooling into a layer of volcanic rock that is a natural drainage source, and that's not actually the aquifer that is at risk. The aquifer that is at risk is underneath a granite or bedrock cap, and for a while back in the 40s, Japan actually thought they had oil there, but then they discovered, oh, well, it's just water. But it's actually the very large resource, and they were in the process of exploring it. For the northern islands, though, that aquifer is probably going to be the most horrific thing ever. And the reason that we're calculating the 11 months is that's based on the WebBot data and how the ill winds played out. So we're just taking that because the unknowns of how fast it's melting, there's no real information coming out of Japan as to how far it's gotten in there. But you can actually go and look at the topology and morphology of the rock of the region and see that it's layers of volcanics material overlaid on a harder quartz-based bedrock, not basalt and not granite really, but an amalgam of basically the crustal or a coastal region uplands of the larger continent of Asia. So the WebBot data suggested that 11 months from basically a 31-month period of time before the whole thing not fades out, but is past its peak. And then we count back the 21 months of the actual steaming, and there you go, 11 months from incept at the pooling stage to eating through into the water. And that's going to cause real problems for all of Asia, not just us, too. We're going to get the radiation to the wind. They're going to get the aquifers contaminated.
Well, and I was reading about the aquifers that they're transboundary and that they basically the whole of Asia will share the waters mix at some point, and so it could that's
correct. Yes, and I think too that the aquifer that is at risk, the larger one, is at a level where it is in that area that it actually joins directly to a large aquifer under China. Yeah. If I can explain this right, it's not trapped in the Japanese island. It is actually within the continental shelf area that the Japanese islands sit on.
Yeah, I was reading something like that too.
Yeah, so it's quite frightening, and the Chinese are taking it very seriously. And this also may account for their recent increase in the flow of cement into the ghost cities.
Yeah.
In the sense they may have to evacuate the coastal population because of radioactive water. They're getting people in Japan now that have measurable levels in the hundreds of thousands of the minor parts of radioactivity measurements. In other words, they used to have 0 and they've got 100,000 BQ readings, or they've got, measurable levels of cesium in their systems. So the Chinese, I don't know how the Chinese are going to react. They have those cities. They appeared to be designed for coastal evac anyway. They may decide to evacuate when they start detecting really serious levels of radiation within the water system, simply because of the cost to their social structure of a plague of birth defects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not for any real feeling for the people per se.
And speaking of perishing, Richard Sauter has a question that I'd like to read for you, which is, how many people do the webbots foresee physically perishing between now and mid-2013?
It depends on how you want to read the data. Okay, it's not as though the data sets explicitly have a numeric value that says that, like a census that says here's the population of the planet. So we have to make inferences. And bear in mind that the articles or the words that we're going to be getting in this are not implying anything. There's no intent on the part of an author to imply a certain level of accuracy of any values within the data we get. So we're making inferences based on what we can find within data sets that have numeric values relative to this. So if there were an article to be written in 2013 that was widespread among the populace, and there was no change in the populace density at all, but the article was greatly discussed and highly disseminated for whatever reason, and everybody talked about it, then we could be under the impression that the majority of the planet would still be there, but that perhaps as many as 1.28 million people would not be. 1.28 billion would not be. So the idea is coming across that there was a population reduction at that level by that period of time or shortly in thereafter. But we don't see. When we look around in the situation at the moment, unless we have a sudden World War III, I don't see any impetus for that level of destruction that rapidly. I do see that we could read it another way, and that is that we could read in the not too distant future articles that might be written along the same lines that would give us the same information and make us think this now, and could have been interpreted as they were interpreted by us, by me particular, in 2003, 4, 5, and 6. And what they're actually discussing is an article that may come out, or a series of statements that we'll all discuss about how 1.28 billion people are to die directly as a result of the Fukushima. Now, it doesn't mean they have died, but we would be thinking about it then as though it were a past event, and that's how it would come back to us. And it may be entirely accurate, but it may also be talking about a 20 or 30-year period, but which we would not have gotten. Make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So when we're answering Richard, yes, we have 1.28, and it just trails off, billion people being impacted, that the data would suggest perished between now and that time. But again, it's all in the wording.
Well, Richard also asks, is there going to be a geographic pole shift or a major crustal slippage or a magnetic pole reversal? And if so, what percentage of Earth's population are going to pass out of this plane?
And I don't see any of those going. And the magnetic pole reversal is potentially more of a problem to us than anything. We won't have a physical crustal shift. I'm quite convinced that all of the data of the past century that interpreted from Velikovsky forward, that interpreted, including Hapgood, that interpreted as a physical crustal shift, are more easily explained with the expansion of the planet, which is a wilder idea, if you will. It's actually easier to conceive of the skin of the orange slipping around than the orange growing. So, no, I don't see that happening, and those are not participatory in our die-off. We've got enough crud going on now that'll kill us off. As a matter of fact, the powers that be deliberately spiked the loop current in order to kill off the Gulf Stream, in order to alter the jet streams, in order to concentrate the radiation in the northern hemisphere, such that background levels would go to such a high extent that they could count on a certain level of humans not surviving. But there's an even screwier interpretation too, if you want to get in it. It's really goofy, and it relates to some strange magical kind of stuff that is beyond the ability of the rational mind to really wrap its head around, and so falls into belief systems. And so we find, for instance, that the belief systems of curious people like L. Ron Hubbard, this strange fellow that created a religion, also had a lot to do with the JPL laboratory and the formation of NASA. He was a magician, a dark black magician kind of a fellow, and was into sexual magic, and he was deeply involved in the Illuminati, and he wrote a bunch of science fiction books. And he was a passable science fiction writer. Not great. I mean, he wasn't an Asimov or a Heinlein or anything. But curiously, one of his books was made into a big, mega kind of a serious movie. And a lot of money put behind it, good special effects and so on. And it bombed, and it was just an abysmal bomb. And it is Battlefield Earth, I think they call it. And it has John Travolta, and it is this 9 or 10 foot high alien. The point of all of this being that the background story to that novel, existence since the 50s, was that there would be a general level, from a series of circumstances, a general level of radiation increase around the planet that was almost deliberately done, because the big space aliens are not radiation hardened. And so they would need to keep the humans around just to go out and about in the area, because we are relatively radiation hardier than they were. And so now there's a screwy explanation for it. And you can actually see in a wild science fiction kind of a story way how a subgroup of the powers that be, knowing that the the bloodline people's greatest wish that their ancestral space aliens are going to come back would do just this in order to cause problems for those space aliens when they arrive.
Thanks, Clif.
A little less gloomy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know a lot of the guys here have a radioactive personality, but would you be able to tell us what the reading is now, and also maybe when you finish, shut it off?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can go ahead and turn it off. Yeah, I just we're running at about 0.03 millisieverts. So it's the real key here is that at that level of constant clicking there, the shocking component is that when I got my first calibrated Geiger counter or radiation meter in 2003, our background radiation was 1 click every 7 or 8 minutes. So we are several orders of magnitude higher than that.
Definitely. Okay, we're going to go on to some science and spirit questions, and the first one's from Paul.
Good morning, Clif. Porida. With your prismatic experiments underway, have you considered this change in the energy of light will be instrumental in the unveiling or lifting of the veil? And as a second part of that, if this veil is lifted, will it result in the return of concepts such as prana, chi, or life force driving the universe? Or will it, due to the Illuminati Hollywood influence, be mistaken for an alien visitation?
Probably both. It's going to just depend on who. There's a lot of us, so there's bound to be tons of people that will misinterpret it. As to the light issue, I don't know that light is a causal agent here. I see light as a symptom. And so the changes in the light are a symptom of the underlying vibrational intensity issues. Let's examine for a second my viewpoint that every 20 or 22 trillion times a second we get a pulse, and that is the basic operating frequency, if you will, or basic crystalline frequency of the watch that we call universe or the materium. And actually, I don't see that pulse is changing, but your use of the word the veil lifting is very apropos. Because myself and many others of whom I've been in contact that are active meditators have been aware that what we call the stream is very active now. And I'm thinking that, well, there's one explanation, and that is that the energy itself is more active. We have more amperage for our electricity, so to speak. But another explanation is that our ability to perceive it is becoming less obstructed. And so if it's less obstructed, then perhaps the veil on us is actually lifting as we speak, and many of us are able to perceive it right now. And I think that's probably the better explanation for what's going on. It's quite clear if you talk to the people that are meditating, especially in 2011, there's been a real acceleration of quickening. And there are many people now I know that were stream enterers, and they just don't have the personal energy to do it at the levels they used to because it's so excitatory, or it's in such an excited state. And I think actually that really it's not that the stream is any more excited, but we're reaching down closer to that 22 trillion times a second basic universal pulse.
Thank you very much, Clif. Yes, that's excellent. Thank you very much, Clif.
A quickening of
Correct. All of those terms apply, and it's really curious. You see people using the term, the shredding of the illusion, which actually is more meaningful in Sanskrit, and that is indeed what's going on. It is as though the veil is lifting, or I think of it as dropping because of how my relationship with the stream is always above me and not below me. But nonetheless, more of it is becoming exposed. It's quite interesting, very scary too.
This is Chipper Dog, and that leads me to the question that I wanted to ask, which I've already asked you once, and you came back and said that you want to noodle this.
Yeah.
And that is, do you have and would you be amenable to sharing or pointing towards any practice, techniques, books, foods, meditative, individual and or group, etc., that might go towards helping moderate and develop more faculty with just what you're talking about? And some of the more traumatic psychic level developments being brought along with this transition event rapidly climbing our backs, so to speak.
With the caveat that every person's destiny is their own. And see, it gets into real problems there because
I agree with you on that.
It's the issue is the unwitting alteration of your own personal karma by unwittingly causing someone else to misinterpret your words and take a series of actions because of how they may perceive your personality. And that's really what it comes down to, okay, is that people take my words as though they really mean something, and I'm not just some bald guy in the woods that's, just done a lot of weird things. And so they put some weight to it. And so I have to be careful because I could say, well, Vipassana meditation is really cool and everybody should go in and jump into that. And I'd be an idiot because everybody should not. Household meditation is not for everybody, just as, Tibetan Buddhist meditation is not for everybody. And so on and so on and so on. And meditation itself is not for everyone because you must acknowledge before you go into it that the practices that are of the Vedic tradition, the meditation and the yoga, will change your personality. Should you pursue them, they will alter you forever. And that is an aspect of your karma you need to be able to face. And so given that as a caveat, I personally have found Vipassana meditation as a householder to be really whiz-bang stuff. I mean, it's really cool. And a lot of the strict meditators in the Chan or the Zen tradition, they give you a real ration of hard stuff there for being a householder. But nonetheless, there have been more enlightened householders than enlightened Zen masters. And so...
Quite a few more.
Quite a few more, correct. So that being the case, at the pinnacle of successful practical tools is the beginnings of everything, and for me was insight meditation and yoga. And I can only speak from personal experience. So there's, I don't know really, I'm very hesitant to advise women at all because there are some fundamental differences that I've become aware of in these last years between male vortices and how we express ourselves as our body and then the vortices themselves. And so I'm sure that some of my practices are not good for women. And you got to be real careful about that. But given that, everybody that is interested in meditation will do themselves well to consider Vipassana as an entry point and then discard it as soon as you find something more suitable to you. But practices for purity of body, anything that'll get you closer to harmonious interaction with your environment. So you don't want to do anything extreme by, like trying a particular kind of a diet or a regimen or this sort of thing. You need to start off with the idea that your goal is harmonious balance, to be right in that middle of the vibrational swings of the pendulum, to be in the sweet spot the whole time, rather than work towards some extreme or other.
Yes, thank you. That goes along with what I feel as well. But I lost a train. Sorry.
That's all right. I have a lot of these days, and I'm sure a lot of it is the Sololunius too, by the way.
Well, I was thinking the integration of the individual's perception of their extent, if you will, their field. It is matching up, is harmonizing with the greater fields. Where it finds itself is what it feels like to me. And
I agree with you. And the boundary layers are much more sensitive and a little bit more active, if you will, simply because of the change in the perception, I think.
And they're an undulating ridge walking is what it feels like to me. Rather than a surfboard, I'm crawling.
No, I agree with you. There's at that level, and that's a very good way of describing it. It's sinusoidal almost in terms of the up and down. It's not, you're not riding anymore. You're
amplitude.
Being taken for a ride. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. I could sit and talk with hours with you on this.
Well, give me a call someday, and we'll sit around and bullshit. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Just one more last question before we talk about boats. Paul.
Oh yes. Hi, Cliff. I've just turned my mic on. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Sure. Yeah. No worries.
Oh, all right. Yeah. There is new science which suggests that the Big Bang and black hole theories are incorrect. Is there any language to suggest that the model for creation will collapse? The second part to it is, if there is, will the ancient Sumerian understanding of creation return to its rightful place? And that's not the Zachariah Sitchin version.
No, I understand that. I've done a lot of the LSD, what else. So, no, I know that. And, you know, it's curious. They have the almost Vedic or Sanskrit notion that I do of the continuous creation destruction, which is expressed as, you know, the Kali and the Vishnu alteration or oscillation. So, yeah, we actually do show that. A lot of it stems from the riots in Rome. That's a temporal marker that when that occurs, there's just everything happens in a huge rush shortly thereafter. The breakdown of the creation understanding probably is beginning to fail globally at an academic level because of something that occurred in November of last year that has yet to reach visibility, but is related to our understanding, in which will we've always said will propel the new electrics. So I suspect that there's, you know, all kinds of activity at a level that we can't, as regular humans walking around, really sense. And it's, you know, at some business level or military level or maybe even in the black ops world, I don't know. And that it will be coming out over time. But the very basic expression of the physics involved will do away with almost everybody's understanding and all the creation myths that we have now, except for those that rely on the idea of the oscillation of all energies.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, we expect some big visibility. I expect some big visibility in the end of November this year.
Yeah. Have you seen Hawking's paradox? Have you seen that?
No, I'm sorry. I have very little time to watch media, so no, I haven't seen that.
Well, he's talking about black holes not existing, you know, or cancelling each other out, you know. So it'll tear it down, I think.
I think so as well. You know, why be all that complicated? It's pretty simple, you know.
Yeah, greater and greater complexity, isn't it? It's like a child caught lying.
And it's also, but it all sort of makes sense that, you know, they're struggling trying to understand this, and complexity is increasing underneath the academic eye as they're looking at it. And yet, how can that be? And it's like, well, duh.
That's right.
It's crashing into each other. What do you expect?
But then they own the agenda, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Yeah, so they can.
And that'll come back on too. I like being a sovereign individual and not being owned by anything. You ought to look at some of the root words there talking about Sumerian and go all the way back to the root word of ownership, because it means to be possessed by.
Yeah.
Not actually, you know, so you are possessed by the theories that you're going to be out there promulgating, or the possessions that you're attached to. And it's better off not to have any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a time for detachment, for the oneness, for the stillness, or whatever you want to call it, you know.
Well, I like to think of it as time to go, you know, sailing and eat pie, but yeah.
or fishing.
There you go. I used to be a fisherman. You know, and like I used to say that, you know, the day that we were so well known. My dad was such a good fisherman, and I was such a good fisherman. I was raised in the wilds of Alaska, and, you know, I could catch the salmon with my bare hands when I was 5 years old.
Oh, great,
you know?
Great.
But the day I gave it up, fish all over the planet had a party.
Yeah, well, I haven't done much with my son this year, so there you go. Well, thank you very much, Cliff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. In prefacing this section, many had noticed for a while Clif using the word boats in many of his reports, articles, and interviews, either directly or in an offhanded or indirect way. Then in the most recent interview with Suzanne Toro and from Shape 4, Clif described a linguistic entity called Future Pop that contained two distinctly separate groups, which had split from the current populace due to cataclysmic circumstances. One group was associated with new electrics, renaissance of science, and high technology, while the other group was associated with scavenging and coastal water-based tribes. Please tell us, Clif, about your fascinations with boats and the importance of boats from your point of view in our future.
Yeah, this is an interesting sort of a story, or an interesting sort of a subject, a context, because I have personal associations, and my dad was a boat builder. My lineage goes all the way back to the Normans, who come by way of the Viking boats and also into the Azores. So I've got both sides of my family are all boat people, really, you know, come by it legitimately, so to speak. However, there's also, in spite of my fascination and enjoyment of boats and so forth, there's also a curious level of a hole in the universe of our thinking relative to boats as a species that encompasses all kinds of things, and boats are currently at the center of a huge archetypical shift that's taking place at the moment, and they are also at the center of our lost understanding of who we are. And we probably should just sort of start off and say that, and take it in reverse and say that, well, our understanding of who we are as a species is skewed because none of the academics on the planet seemingly are small boat people. Because everybody that is an archaeologist or someone who investigates the past of human history is all about the way that great masses of humans are all going truckabout over the land all the time. And they even go to such great extent to hypothesize land bridges in order to see that groups of people that are sharing similar cultures have a way of communicating with each other. And they do so at great extent of fabrication of theories and postulates and so on, all to avoid the idea that for some reason, I don't know why they're avoiding it, that people used boats to get around. Now, it is true that if you were a space alien and you landed on our planet and you just saw our species, you wouldn't really think much of us as a seafaring species at the moment. You would note that we would have a huge amount of activity on the ocean. In fact, the largest single warehouse on the planet is all of the boats that are in truckabout with all the goods stored on them. And it's also the largest single component of our economic base that is never taken into account. We don't take into account, for instance, all of the millions of gallons of diesel oil currently in the holds of all of the boats on the planet, nor their goods, nor their impact on the pollution, nor their impact on the hiring of the planet at a species level, and so on. And yet they are a very significant level of our social order and mostly ignored. And if you were a space alien and you're looking into our past history and you followed our academic leanings, you would think that we were basically scared of the water. And nothing could be further from the truth. All parts of the human body express ourselves as coastal dwellers, which is why we still live in the main all around the coasts. If you look, for instance, you see that human beings are used to looking for predators at eye level and below, and that we're used to escaping predators in two different ways, climbing and swimming. We know this because of our instant ability as infants to be able to grasp and climb from our monkey ancestors, and we also know that we're swimmers by the pattern of the secondary sexual characteristics in the human body, including hair growth. And also, by the way, curiously, the way our teeth and our nails form. That's a long discussion there. But in any event, so we're designed to interact and run away from lions and stuff and escape in the surf. And then when the lions go away, we come out. And so naturally, one would think, oh, this is cool stuff. I like this water. What else can we do with it? And you see a stick floating on it, and you think, well, as long as I'm out here hanging around trying to wait out that hungry lion over there, I'll get on this little stick floating around and paddle away and see if I can't get away from the lion a little bit earlier than simply waiting around for his whim to go away. And so one thing leads to another, and you've got your stick, and pretty soon you think, well, I'll be the master of two sticks that are floating, and I'll be that much better, and I'll be drier, and next thing you know, we've got mega yachts. But along the way, we lose this idea that the real core of who we are as humans has to do with how we were and how we still can be and still are as boat creatures, as creatures that are not strictly land dwellers. And the vast majority of us are. There's no impetus within our society other than a few tax laws that are just sops to lobbyists. There's no impetus in our society to put us back into the boating world. And if we look at the way the distribution of small boat activity is around the planet, we find that in spite of the subtle and not so subtle pressures of the powers that be against the small boating activity in the Anglo-American Empire, we still continue to do small boating activity. Now, a lot of this can be traced back to, in the Anglo-American Empire anyway, back to the hassles that the current bloodline aristocrats had with the great sea peoples that existed and were their contemporaries before the cataclysm. And a lot of the information can be taken as conjecture, but if you go to the trouble of reading some Sanskrit works, you find that a lot of the Vedic texts refer to the great sea peoples, and we have huge amounts of evidence that these sea peoples exist, including all of the historic evidence that goes all the way back into Egypt. And the Proto-Atlantean and the subsequent movement of the people around the planet. And so, for instance, we have a curious memory about how we are with boats and stuff. And also, we know that there is a deliberate attempt to hide from us who we were in the past as seafaring people. Most people are not aware that when the United States, when the continental North America was being explored, that a great number of or stellae in the plural, these big, tall obelisk critters, carved stone things, were found at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And these stele had multiple languages on them, including Egyptian hieroglyphs, Sumerian cuneiform, presumed Sumerian, and something resembling Sanskrit, and they told who knows what. We don't know, because they were probably all residing wherever it is we keep all of our super secret stuff, below the Smithsonian or wherever, but they were all gathered up and removed by the powers that be and stored away because they didn't want people to know that this continent had been routinely visited by the peoples from whom the pharaohic Egyptians descended. Nor did they want them to know that there exist caves now in Australia that we have yet to discover that are still filled with relics of these pre-pharaohic Egyptians, seafaring people that used hieroglyphics that the Egyptians used, and so on. We have a lot of evidence to this. Now, a lot of that evidence has disappeared or has been hidden away, and we're also seeing from a linguistic viewpoint that the powers that be are filtering out the historical, they're putting pressure on academia to not support people that are investigating our historical use of boats as a species and the really cool things we used to do with them and all of this, the traffic we used to have around the whole planet. There are many authors that have noted things like the mummies having cocaine and tobacco in them that could have only come from South America, when theoretically the Egyptians never went to South America. And that theoretic is a big, huge word, because we've got evidence that the people we think of as the Egyptians, in fact, used a double voyaging canoe structure very similar to the Viking boats, two giant Viking boats joined with a deck and a bifold or a tripod or bimod mast that was a shunting mast, and they voyaged all over the planet. We find remnants of Egyptian words and culture in Polynesia, of all places, and they trace their lineage of hull shapes and sailing techniques all the way back to the pharaohs. And yet none of this is ever spoken of. You never hear this even discussed in academia. And yet the historical records and shape of all of the boats and how we've used them and the sail rigs tells a tale every bit as instructive as going and looking at a bunch of stones that haven't moved. The difference is whether you're interpreting a dynamic history or the static history. And academics have made their careers on the static history because it's so hard to interpret effectively the dynamic history, because the boats basically all rot away. And so there's a giant hole in our species that isn't being promoted, yet we still find within us an archetype, a pressure at some level emotionally that keeps pushing us back to them. So I personally find that very fascinating. And then I'm also one of those people that's affected by that. Make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so at that level, I've also explored for decades now the history of boat types, hull forms, at an archaeological level. And I know, for instance, that it was the British racing rules structure that came into effect in the 1850s as part of the big boom that was going on that ultimately led to the Civil War in the United States in the 1860s, but it was that racing rule structure that led us to the miserable state of the boating world we have today in the United States, with all these little plastic boats that are not seaworthy. And most of the boats that we produce in the United States are not seaworthy. They would fail under any of Markey's test for seaworthiness. And in fact, the Fastnet race of 1979 proved just that statement, that most boats we're producing are not seaworthy. And we've gone a long way from our roots. There's a lot of stuff within the data suggesting that the two trends of new electrics and the future pop of the scavengers are not mutually exclusive, and in fact are quite dependent upon each other, and that it will be something from the scavenging community that will be a key component of the new electrics, and that they in turn will benefit from the ability to have electric propulsion systems, etc.
Is small boats a sign of the Aquarian age, where I know you mentioned previously that the Piscean age was more centralism, large corporations, large businesses, large cities, whereas we're moving to a small self-organizing collectives. And obviously in those situations, you won't need massive roads and infrastructure. You'd probably try to navigate through nature's way, through boats and through, walking through paths and stuff.
Correct, as we have demonstrated was most effective for 10 or 12,000 years. Correct. Yeah, and actually it's an expression of that. The larger archetype of the trend away from the giant collective state, the schooling effect, so to speak, of the Piscean age being replaced by the sovereign nature of the Aquarian age is best expressed perhaps in the small boating community. Because let me tell you, when you're out there in a small boat, you are a sovereign individual. You would really be a fool to expect a rescue. You can cry for it and hope that it comes there, but to expect it is absurd. If you get yourself into a problem, you've got to get yourself out. And I have no respect for boaters that take any other approach. The guys that go out on a whim and, a case of beer and a few friends, they're the ones that end up getting people killed. And they don't do it with any seriousness, and that's not the individuals I really reference when I say small boating community. I'm not talking about the yahoos that drive their boats with the empty beer keg on their head. I'm talking about the people that are out there basically. Well, this is let's jump into the other part of this. Leave the historical for a moment and go into the current. We have reason, and I've written some of the articles about it, we have evidence that suggests there's a large-scale archetypical shift going on. And that shift is every bit as intense as the Industrial Revolution, and it's mostly unobserved. What we're seeing, fleshing itself out by the day, is a shift from the major heavy industries down into backyard personal production of the same level of goods. So with the new synthetics of the unbreakable unbreakable fiber arts, let's just call it that include carbon fiber, Kevlar, all of the new stuff coming on, all the aramid fabrics, and then the use of the resins and the other polymers, we have now replaced steel, and we've done it in a way that was most unexpected. You've got guys out there that have said, oh, okay, hey, I can take this carbon fiber fabric and make a really cool fender for my car, so why don't I just make a whole body for my car and eliminate all that steel? And they just keep going on and on and on, pressing these boundaries. And this archetypical shift is, I think, if you want to call it, it's the new industrialization, or I don't really want to use that term because industry doesn't really apply. Maybe it's a new craftization where we're going to go back to handcrafted, but at a very, very, very sophisticated level that will eliminate huge levels of heavy industry. And we're just at the beginning of it. So the very first factory, so to speak, in Britain that marked the industrial age has yet to be built, but the people who were figuring out then how to run the belts and how to transmit power through that whole thing are at work, and we're at that stage in this new process. And where do we find a center of that? Well, we find certain centers of it within the radio-controlled airplane world and radio-controlled model cars, as well as the industrial robotics, exoskeleton and coverings world, as well as in its largest and most clear and easily found form in the world of small boats. So once again, it appears as though we're going to be faced with a social trend that will shift us in the future back to the past, so to speak. And then one other thing that has entered into this is that there is now plenty of evidence to suggest that an 1890s social style blooming or a reformation is going to occur within the United States, or is underway actually. And that in 1890s it was concurrent with a depression and was also concurrent with all kinds of social unrests, race riots, thousands of black people killed in New York because they were seen as taking away the jobs of the immigrant Irish and so on. A very horrific time. But at that same time was the beginning of the bloom for 15 or 20 years of the boating community that had the United States invent paper boats at a mass market level that were safe and for their circumstances, seaworthy. And it led to what we now have as a boating community, which is really the remnants of that huge social flush of 1890. And we're seeing those same large-scale social trends manifest. So it's not particularly pertinent now. And if we ended up getting into a situation of stock markets and that sort of thing being meaningful 10 years from now, I would say it might be really smart to invest in the companies that will at that point be producing whatever we will be working with as the new small boats. And I have a tendency to think that a lot of those will be commercial in the sense that the small boating community won't be recreationally focused. It'll be transport and trade, etc. Sort of cohesive statement there?
It does. Lenny's got a quick question.
Sure.
Clif, is the archetype of the boat that's surfacing due to a survival need? And are you setting sail primarily because of the threat of nuclear radiation, or because of the rising waters, or just because you feel like it? And
well,
then
no, I like sailing, and the idea to sail with, if we had to exit, the idea would be the radiation in the northern hemisphere would be the operating impetus. But no, the boat, I think, is an expression of a larger archetype that's working its way out of all of us, which is the push back towards a sovereign individual. And many people find themselves at their most sovereign when they're 100% taking care of themselves out sailing on boats they built. And failing, or secondary to that, would be out sailing on any boat where you still have to be responsible for yourself at a very core level. And it gives you a level of satisfaction as well as a level of confidence that can't be taken away from you. You know, it's very powerful.
So it's really getting in touch with your core being.
Correct. And at the same time, there are, lots of people that are afraid of water, and there's all these other issues relative to that at a personal level with boats, the fear thing, and boats are dangerous. We have to acknowledge that the insurance industry is not lying when they say that any given activity is 35 times more likely to create an accident on the water than on land. But given all of that, while I say it is an expression of the larger times that we're moving into, and a burgeoning expression, and probably a growing expression, and is sort of a symptom of all of this separation as we come down into more of sovereign individuals, I think to a certain extent, too, there may be some weird, quirky little evolutionary thing about boats, in the sense that there are people out there that will tell you that human beings evolved the brains they have and the skills and the dexterity we have swimming away in the coastal waters from predators. And I think that a larger archetype of that could be expressed as us guys monkeying about on small boats are an evolutionary force, if you will. Make sense?
Thank you.
Sure. By the way, the whole thing about the boats and the history of the Polynesians and stuff has led me to the conclusion that the author of the boat, or the book called Wangka, W-A-N-G-K-A, I think, which is the description of a hull form, who wrote about the Polynesian boats, I think it's quite correct to say that the boat model we have now, the monohull, is the worst possible thing we could have chosen as a species, and that the Polynesians really had it right with the multi-hulls. Now, this is really interesting because here we are at a period of time when the expression of the species is moving in a tendency away from huge, heavy industries, the steel and so forth, into the smaller craft-produced fiber arts that lend themselves to the lightweight, unsinkable kind of boats. So it's a natural nexus, if you will, of enlightened self-interest and juxtaposition of those self-interests that is producing the renaissance of new materials, new hull forms, and stuff relative to boats that we're starting to see come out. Now, then there's the other uglier side of it all. We're going to get Earth changes relative to an expanding planet, and since the planet's going to expand, I expect a lot of the bridges will be ripped apart, and at the same time that we're going to be in a financial position where we may not be able to afford to replace them. We have personal experience up here in Olympia where we had the Nisqually quake, and it took a year and a day before one of our older bridges that was destroyed was replaced. Now, if we magnify that by 1,000 times, well, maybe we would still be waiting 11 years or 10 years later for that bridge to be replaced if the earthquake had been large enough to take down enough bridges, simply because we're going to have to prioritize what's worth rebuilding when, and especially with diminishing resources from a failing just-in-time system that's dependent upon oil. Now, a lot of this is pointing to, West Virginia coming out as the Saudi Arabia of the United States simply because they have all the coal and the other resources. And so certain parts of the country are going not boat related, are going to be key industry players if we get through this, next few years through 2013. We have no real certainty that the long-term data is still valid, but I have a theory that explains why we have so much immediacy data and why the immediacy data is still growing. If when we get into the interpretation now, we see that the immediacy data has grown even further, and I don't have those numbers yet, then we'll be able to say that theory has a little bit more validity, and it sort of makes sense. And it also sort of relates to boats. And it's kind of like the way that I've been describing it is that we're standing in our data sets looking out at a horizon. And unfortunately, a storm is coming, and as the storm comes, it has the effect of moving our attention away from the horizon, which is a degree of arc away from us, right up to the beach in front of us, because it brings up the waves from these nice, gentle, placid things, which we can look at way far away, to the big, angry waves that are demanding our attention by being right in front of our face and taller than we are. Does that sort of make sense as a description?
It does, yes.
Yes, it does.
Okay, if that description were valid, and there is some mathematical reason to think that that is the case, and we'll know more the next interpretation we get into, and theoretically the next interpretation after that, then what we're actually looking at is huge amounts of froth as a result of an emotional storm, and that should we be able to part that froth, we would still be able to see that, yes, the horizon still exists and there's still waves out there. Now, I don't know that for certainty either way at the moment, but there's some reason to suggest that that is indeed what's going on. And again, it brings us back to the whole boat thing, which I could go on for hours and hours and hours, but my point of bringing it up was to suggest to people that a personal level of small boating activity, and I'm talking the 25-footers less up to the 40-footers perhaps, to the, boats that a person could build in their lifetime and take out, that there's a lot in our data that suggests, especially in the Gulf area, for all those people that are listening, that the people that down there, those poor benighted souls that are out, in the middle of hot summer working on a boat in their backyard, these are the guys to pay attention to, because they're going to basically be local community leaders, and it sort of makes sense at a very practical, fundamental level. And that is, those people that are out building boats are some of the most skilled individuals around in a very diverse way, because they've got to be able to handle all of the different kinds of materials to produce basically a habitat, and a habitat that is a compromise the very beginning. So again, it means that the small boating community is used to effective, practical compromise daily to solve problems. And they don't usually, as a rule, you don't find the small boaters wasting their times as politicians, and nor would they approach politics quite the same way as the politicians that we've got. And so the kind of society that will arise from them will have at its core a value structure that will persist for generations, that the same way that the value structure that is at the underlying core of the Japanese society persists from the Meiji era and the relationship of the populace to the farmer. Long way, and it's probably lost on most people, but you'd have to know the Japanese and how they revere the farming tradition, even if they might be young and stupid and dissonant at the moment. In the bravado of youth, the longer formation of that relationship is so key to their national identity, and that's what our data is suggesting is going to be the outcome for the United States. In fact, the data is quite clear that the cowboy myth will die away, and that the new myth, I don't know what it'll be labeled, of these scavenger guys out in their little boats will take its place.
Wow. Unc, you had a question?
Yes, thanks, Jules. Cliff, this is Zucky Bubby.
Sure, yeah.
To a non-boathead, that's the play on words for the folks in the forum, botheads that they are. That was kind of
like that. I'm just a sucker for crap like that. Go ahead.
Glad you liked that. Now I've got to find my question again. I am so sorry.
Oh, that's all right. Sorry. Oh, the non-boatheads, yeah.
Yeah, okay. To a non-boathead, is there any advice to someone unfamiliar to boating at sea you could recommend, i.e. boating purchasing or anything to help get by till dry land is found for the landlubber?
Well, see, that's the whole point. There's no reason to take to the boats and go out to the sea except if the idea that there was going to be a crustal shift. And I've eliminated that possibility in my own mind based on the evidence and the expansion of the planet theory, and especially the most recent developments in Mexico and in South America, because they just fell perfectly in line with what we should expect. So I don't expect that the vast majority of the people will have to relocate. Now, it is true that I expect a lot of coastal disruption, and people should consider having to relocate away from the coasts if they're not prepared to deal with what we've got coming. But we've also got other issues arising. Larger planet means we're going to have greater winds at a lower level closer to the ocean. So a lot of the boat stuff we've got now is not appropriate. And no, I don't think people that are... let me put it this way. I'm a great believer. The only belief system I have says to me that the best thing for any human or any life is to be as harmonious as possible with the universe around it. Now, that also means the universe within you. And so I'm a poor bastard. Was driven into boats, and I can't help myself. So I'm afflicted, right? It's a disease. And I can't help myself, but I'm not suggesting that anybody not so pushed by universe should go out there and do that. Universe might very appropriately push somebody to go and be a mountain dweller or a plains dweller, because that's where they should be relative to their vibration and what they need to learn and their karma and so on. But what I'm suggesting, and the reason that I bring it up and the reason that I don't want to say harp on it, but that I stress the whole boat issue is not merely to highlight the self-sufficiency and so on, but as a counter to a deliberate agenda on the part of the powers that be to do away with that. And so I think we need to support the poor boat lunatics because the powers that be don't like them and they don't want them out there. And I think that they may fear the self-sufficiency and the sovereign nature of these individuals and their skill levels. That's just supposition on my part, but there is evidence that they are actively working to suppress this. And thus, the enemy of my enemy kind of thing, is my buddy, and especially since it's, I'm born to it. And I really do want to promote it, and the universe wants me to. So it's like, okay, this all makes sense in the grander scheme of things, too. And in a certain extent, it's like the non-boat guys, there's probably a real good reason you aren't a boat guy and don't follow us. We're crazy. My wife will stand up and acknowledge that any damn day you want. He's crazy. Get him away from the damn boats.
land guys are kind of crazy too sometimes. So,
well, there you go.
Well, the reason what had brought this up was you were talking about the expansion of the Earth. I'm kind of deviating here, but the water was appearing and coming from the ground, from what I understood that the report was saying. And so there is where I was thinking that the swelling or the flooding was coming from, was from this formation of oceans in the middle of nowhere. You know,
the formation of the basic materials of the hydrogen and all the gases which percolate themselves up through the compression of the planet. That's how we have oil. It starts off as the formation of the energy leaps from the sun. It goes to the middle of our planet, right through all of us, gets captured by the plasma, which is a giant magnetic bubble, and it compresses it and creates matter out of it, which percolates up through all the other matter that's already been laid on top of that bubble. Some of this matter will show up as water. I think that the water levels that Graham Hancock records in his book Underworld, which forced the Hindu population to retreat to what is now modern India in its shape, which is reduced by some 40% more or less from its previously inhabited shape. I think that water actually did come from the planet. There's no evidence at that time that we went through any area of space and got any more micrometeorites that were water-based or any of that sort of thing, and there's a whole lot of evidence that that occurred at an expansion period. So, if we were to grant that the expansion theory was correct, and if we were to grant that the water was one of the things that was produced, and that the Sanskrit text that recorded the destruction of the older India and the relocation of the people to the new India, then we got some really good clues there. And some of the things that it tells us is, we don't really have to sweat it. That the water came up, but it didn't come up so fast that this was a tsunami. It didn't come up so fast that this was a giant wave from hell the way that the movies would have you think of it. But it did come up fast enough that the effect was, as was described in many Sanskrit books that you can even go and read today about that period of time, where they record the tide came in. Came in an extra few feet. Came in an extra few feet and didn't go away as much as the last time. Next day when it came in, damn if it didn't come in an extra few more feet. And geez, you know, Mrs. Kodesh over there, her porch is underwater now. 4 days later, Mrs. Kodesh's house is got a foot of water in it, and she's had to relocate into her backyard. And you just keep going on and on and on like that, and over the course of some number of years, you suddenly discover that, geez, what used to be your city is now 30 feet underwater and is still sinking. And so that kind of effect is what we can expect from the flooding relative to the expanding planet. Then we have a historical record of this. I mean, there's the discussion of these people in the Harappan Valley of the northwestern part of India from, we think we can date it from about 13,000 years ago, that discuss basically this. And there's a couple of cities there that were right at the joining, so to speak, of India and Pakistan in that region, where the cities are continually creeping inland, and it's a trend that they, in their own city records, they point out has been going on for over 1,000 years. So there's no reason to suggest to think that trend wasn't, as we see mostly in nature, a huge onrush and then a trailing off that we're still seeing today. So I don't worry about that. The boatheads don't have to worry about fleeing on water and facing their fear of water, or for whatever reason not being a boathead. You know, I'm afraid of flat places. I lived in Kansas and I can't stand that. So, you know, if you can live there, hey, more power to you.
Okay. Well, that kind of alleviated this part because I have a son that's an offshore boat captain in the Gulf of Mexico, and I was thinking that until fuel is gone, if this flooding occurs, but if it's more of a gradual flooding, it wouldn't be such as a tidal wave, such a thing. But until fuel is gone, something like that, will someone in those positions be able to help or rescue people that do get stranded? Because there will probably be some of that going on. Do you see anything like that happening as far as... Sure.
Actually, we have a history of that in our future pop going back to like 2003. And it was really disturbing because it was showing that there was this trend of all of these, basically a water tribe that was going to take over what we now think of as the Gulf states. And that for some reason inland would be more uninhabitable than the coastal region. Why that should be, I don't know. We never really did get that clarified, but the historical record... it may not be pertinent. It may just be that there's more verbiage written about the people living along the coast. And also some of these things that we see, that they're going to be a huge source of like I say, an interaction with the new electrics is going to, they'll be like an adoption point, not an origination point, but just, a practicality, a proving ground for it, because they'll need it.
That really sounds, like a good thing, though.
In the end, after all of the crud, I believe so. We got a couple of nasty years, and then some really very hardy and cool people will get up one morning and decide they're just not going to sit still for this stupid problem anymore, and they're going to go on out and solve it. And one thing will lead to another, and you got a whole new nation being built.
This kind of popped in my head, and I forgot about it, but recently I read something about China had something like a 65-foot swell or wave or something like that that flooded a chemical plant. Is there anything?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
And we've this I believe is a continuation of the trend that we've seen of the mega waves, or the freak waves they would call them. The things that supposedly would knock over the Poseidon and create the Poseidon adventure. Those have really increased. That disturbance, though, in China, I actually believe is related to what's going on now in Ecuador, what we're seeing up here in the tides, what we're seeing in some of the bays in Alaska, and I think it's probably a precursor to the crack in the Pacific Plate.
Oh, makes sense.
Because it can be expected that, if we think of it this way, that as the pressures in the inner Earth push up, the largest single unobstructed plate we have in the ocean is the Pacific Plate. And we can sort of think of it as like a sheet of metal or something capping a pressure, which is the metal is going to vibrate, and in our case we're going to say that the material being produced underneath the plate that's ultimately going to lead to it cracking will probably go through several phases where it will push to a peak and deflect the plate and thus cause waves and so forth, and then subside as some of those gases and other materials find ways to relieve the pressure. It won't be a continuous thing leading to a sudden sharp crack. I believe it'll be a series of events, probably gaining in importance, very much like we saw with St. Helens, where we had early steaming all the way up through to the final kablooey.
Does that indicate with this expansion that there's going to be less ground surface area than now, or?
No, larger.
Oh, okay, larger.
Okay, if you go all the way back to where Earth was, basically it was a plasma ball in space-time that decided to create some matter and start plastering itself with matter and grew itself into a planet. And at one point, all of the planet was all solid material, except for maybe one little tiny lake. And then it kept growing and growing and growing and kept growing more lake material, and eventually the lakes became the ocean. And we now have a preponderance on the surface anyway of the lighter material, which is the water. And all of the lighter material wants to rise to the surface, so we'll see a lot more of that. But again, it's not going to be as people expect. When the plate cracks in the Pacific, we may actually even see new lands appear, because it may be of such a level that volcanoes and stuff that are just percolating now will suddenly really rush up. Sort of makes sense? I mean, they'll get a big push. It won't be a permanent state. It might lead to a lot of volcanism of a temporary nature and the formation of some new property out there. I wouldn't want to homestead it right away, though.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I've got one last piece here, and I'll let someone else speak with you. You mentioned associates such as Igor having no plans to hit in the water. Do you have any advice or hints from the reports on a better way to manage that scenario?
There is the issue of the radiation, which has to be dealt with practically and in a pragmatic matter. We're seeing a lot of suppression of anybody who wants to put out how bad the radiation levels are anywhere in the northern hemisphere. And it has to be acknowledged that they're not anywhere near as bad south of the equator. So now Igor here, he's got a plan that makes sense given where he's at, and he's looking at southeast Alaska. And the reason he's looking up there has to do with ocean flows, the jet stream flow, and how most of the radiation at this point appears to be bounded by 30 degrees to about 50 degrees, and more of it actually being shoved up in Canada at the moment than is hitting the U.S. So his idea is, to some, and has some merit, is that the closer you are to the North Pole, the greater the chance you'll have less concentrated radiation. And it may be that that's true, and still meaningless in the sense if it becomes too radioactive down in the northern hemisphere in total, then it won't make any difference. It'll still be fatal levels, perhaps that high. We don't know how bad it's going to get with Fukushima. The rock structure underneath the next volcanic layer that it's got to melt through will pretty much tell the tale. And so we're going to keep an eye on the Fukushima outfall in terms of whether it gets steam or white smoke or whatever. But Igor's plan makes sense. He really investigated the Rockies. He's not a water guy. He's inland actually now even. And he likes caves, and he's got a good cave situation where he's at now, but he's got a bad political situation because he's caught near the Chinese city that will be in Idaho, and also the theoretical allocation of land to China and Washington State and so on. And so there's all these political things that have got him a little bit weirded out, and so he just wanted to be a little bit more isolated. And he chose Southeast Alaska. Now we've got a number of other individuals that we know that have just opted away from the northern hemisphere. Now let's also divert real quick back to boats for a second. One of the things that one might want to keep an eye on as a regular human would be the movement of the mega yachts around the planet, because the mega yachts, of course, are tied to the mega wealthy, and the 1% who own everything on the planet, including us, or so they say, would do things early and take care of themselves and so on. And so it's curious that for the first time ever here in the Northwest, we've had a number of mega yachts dock in the last few weeks. This is very curious because the mega yachts that are docking up here, sailboats and motor yachts, should not be here this time of the year because it's not our good cruising time. In fact, it's nearly the end of the season, and we're already starting to get fall-like weather up here, even though it's not even the middle of August. And I actually spent a number of hours today getting my heating system all spiffed up for winter because I can feel it in the air when I get up in the morning. So I find it very curious that we're seeing a number of these very large yachts make splashes as they come on into Seattle and environs and stock up before heading north. And it's curiouser and curiouser with each new mega yacht. We're talking 190 footers. We're talking boats with masts that are 180 feet high and motor yachts that are 200 feet long. I mean, that's a battleship in my opinion. And these guys are here now in August. I might believe it if it was March. It might make more sense in a cruising sense of the word. But and the collection of them, it just kind of begs the question of what's up.
That's true.
Interesting.
Thank you, Cliff.
Sure.
Is there any indication where they're headed?
Yeah, they're all taking what we call the Inland Passage and scooting up out of the Washington waters up into B.C. And that's the leading into the area of the what we call the Haida Gwaii, otherwise known to by their slave name as the Queen Charlotte's Islands. The aristocrats named all of the sounds and bays up here after themselves. So a lot of us prefer to use the Salish names. But they're heading up into this area from Desolation Sound north. And what's really funny, I mean quite odd, given our weather patterns and everything, it's against the flow. If you were in Desolation Sound in that region right now, you would see that all the cruising boats, all the 40 and 50 footers and the 30 footers and so forth, they're all heading south because
right.
the weather is turning. So this is, and there's nothing up there. There's no events or any reason for this to occur.
Maybe
that
it's
I'd find
a wintering
anyway.
spot.
Maybe it's which?
A wintering spot?
I don't mean to laugh, but we don't have an official hurricane season up here. We have winter. And no, I mean, I could do it with a small boat, but it would be very dangerous in the rocky coastland of British Columbia to be wandering around, so to speak, and trying to do cruising in some of these bays with large boats in the winter because of the tidal actions we have up here, as well as the storms. I mean, it's quite brutal. There's our fishing fleets out here. They're the most dangerous occupations on the planet because of the weather we have to face. So it just doesn't make sense that they're up here just as that weather is starting to break.
Thanks, Chipper. Thanks, Cliff. Okay, before we close the interview, we just have one more final question in regards to probably the most important thing in your data, since you saw it all the way in 1997 of the sun disease. You did a special with Jeff Rentz on the solar issues and a step-by-step expectation of what the solar issues, how it would ramp up in these coming years. I was wondering if there was anything else you wanted to say in regards to how, in terms of what you expected with the solar issues and when you think the biggest impact would hit, especially as you mentioned in the last Suzanne Toro interview, that May to March of next year would probably be the most intensive eventful period of our time.
March of 2012 to May of 2013 is undoubtedly going to be the peak relative to our data. It's always pointed to that. Our data sets have indicated in the past that some of the earlier effects may happen as early as fall of this year. So it's curious that the sun and the Elenin and all the comets and all of this is coming together with one of our crashcades that is also had been previously tied to the Terra data and space coat farts. So I'm actually really expecting that maybe Patrick Garrell's understanding of the sun will be backed up by reality, and that the sun itself will express itself in a way we've never seen before in October. And that may also account for some of the language we're seeing about what's going to come in March of next year. March of next year is the last building tension peak, and it settles down to the floor by May of next year, and then we have all these little things. But by peak, I mean something that's noteworthy. So we're in the soup now, especially from October onward. Solar stuff needs to be taken into account. You should get sunglasses, and have your plans made and ready to go by this October. Should we get the disruptions even at the electrical grid level, those will be quite disturbing. So, but other than that, we don't have any new data. It has been, other than what the sun is doing, and I've been following that religiously almost. I get up every morning and check stereo A, stereo B, and see what's going on in all the sun observatories just to stay current, because it is changing very rapidly. Never thought I'd live to see that, I mean, when you're born on this planet, and in my case, and you live through the 50s and 60s, there are some things you take for granted, that the sun is one of those stable constants, and how little we realized,
Yes, like they said, the future's so bright, we better wear shades.
There you go.
Chipper wanted to say a poem before we ended. Chipper.
Chipper's off, I think.
Hello, Chipper. Chipper.
Yeah, I guess you can't talk into a muted mic very easily. And then turn it this way. Character, emotion, action is all contained within an it, obviously imitative in concerted rhythmic grip. However else could my eyelash out with viscous whip to snare a formative reaction as eye moves about its ship, where soiled feet and ragged hands come into solid play, lost in a maelstrom, whipped into froth just past the quay, eerily seduced retreadings of what some dismiss as clay, intent on finding reasons to take home a sailor's pay. And like this, the thing is spinning in formation, flying into heady squalls of assorted natures, and may depend on insides of some wall with which to cut the rest of it into just the right size ball to take away from in the game and head back down the hall. Namaste.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you for your time tonight, Cliff. As the poet Percy Shelley wrote in his masterpiece, Ozymandias, it is inevitable that civilizations fall, just as inevitable that everyone alive today will die. So it's not the length of the life that lived, but the way they lived those precious moments in history, what they did, who they became. And during those times of great change, some people need guidance, inspiration, direction, a spark. Your work to many has been that spark, that direction, that inspiration. And with that, you may have just made all the difference. On behalf of Fox and all the members of the WebWatt Forum, thank you, Cliff. May you and your family have many pies to come.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, guys.
Namaste, Cliff.
Namaste.
This has been great.
Thanks a lot, Cliff.
Thank you, guys. We'll do it again.
Okay, thanks.